See, Silas Cruel didn't knock. He never knocked. Men like Silas Cruel didn't need to, they owned the doors. See, he walked straight into the Blackthorn ranch house on a Tuesday morning in October, while Gideon Rourke was still pulling on his second boot, and he dropped a folded paper on the kitchen table like a man dropping a cigarette on a dirt floor. See, like it meant nothing. Like 22 men's livelihoods meant nothing. See, 30 days, Silas said, not looking at Gideon, looking around the room, already calculating what the furniture might sell for. See, Gideon picked up the paper. His hands were steady. See, his stomach was not. 30 days to pay the full balance, or I begin foreclosure proceedings on the land, the livestock, and every structure on this property. Silas straightened his coat. See, I'd suggest you start packing, Rourke. Winter's coming, and I don't think you want 22 men sleeping in the snow. See, he left without closing the door. The cold came straight in off the mountain. See, that moment, a smug banker walking out of a kitchen while a man stood holding a paper that could end everything he'd spent 15 years building, that was the moment that started all of it. See, the hunger, the fire, the smoke, and the woman who stepped off a stagecoach carrying butcher knives instead of wedding dresses. See, if you were standing in Gideon Rourke's boots that morning, what would you have done? See, before we go any further, if this kind of story speaks to you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. See, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. See, I want to see how far this story travels, and if it moves you, leave a like, it helps more than you know. See, now let's go back to where it all began. See, the paper Silas Crowell had left on the table said $4,200. See, that was the number, $4,200, which in the autumn of 887 and 80s in the Wyoming territory was the kind of sum that might as well have been written in a foreign language. See, Gideon read it 3 times, set it down, then walked outside to the yard where 2 of his men were trying to drag the carcass of a dead steer off the frozen ground. See, his 3rd this week. He stood there for a long moment, watching them work, and he didn't say anything at all. See, what was there to say? The blizzard that had rolled through in the first week of October had been early and mean, and it had taken 11 head from his herd before the temperature finally eased enough for a man to breathe without his lungs burning. See, 11. And those weren't the only losses. See, his cook, old Pete Dunnigan, had died of a chest fever 3 weeks before the blizzard hit, which meant that 22 men were now surviving on whatever Gideon could shoot and whatever could be done with dried beans. See, cornmeal, and enough stubbornness to keep a fire going. See, boss. That was Callum Hayes, his foreman, coming across the yard with his hat in his hands. See, Callum was 41 years old and had the face of a man who'd seen most of what the West could throw at a person. See, he didn't say anything else. He'd seen Silas Crowell ride in, and he'd seen him ride out, and he could read the shape of what that visit had left behind, just from the way Gideon was standing. See, 30 days, Gideon said. Callum put his hat back on. See, how much? 4,200. Callum let out a breath that fogged immediately in the cold air. See, he looked out across the yard at the dead steer being hauled away. See, you want me to tell the men? No. Gideon said it immediately, then stopped. See, changed his mind, maybe. I don't know yet. Let me think. See, he didn't have anything to think with. That was the problem. See, when a man has spent 3 weeks hunting for meat to keep 22 mouths fed, when his livestock die in the cold and his savings drain down to almost nothing. See, when a banker walks in on a Tuesday morning and tells him 30 days, thinking is not exactly the resource that's most available. See, what Gideon had instead was the thing that had kept him alive through 15 years of mountain trapping and ranching in country that didn't welcome weakness, the ability to stay on his feet when everything else was falling down. See, he wasn't a man who cried. He wasn't a man who raged. See, he was a man who went very, very quiet when things got bad, and then he started looking for what was still standing. See, what was still standing at Blackthorn Valley Ranch in October of 1887 was not very much. See, he had 22 men who had not been paid in 6 weeks. See, he had a herd that had been reduced to 43 head, most of them thin and stressed from the early cold. See, he had a smokehouse that Pete Dunnigan had used for occasional bacon, and nothing more a low, dark structure behind the kitchen that smelled like old ash and neglect. See, he had a ranch house that needed a new roof on the east side. See, and he had about $200 in cash money in a tin box under his bed. See, $4,200. He went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the walls. See, it was Callum who suggested the advertisement. He brought it up 2 days later, carefully, the way you bring up something to a man who's had a bad week sideways, like you're not really saying it. See, he'd heard about other ranchers doing it, putting a notice in the Eastern papers. See, seeking a woman capable of frontier life, willing to take on the work of a ranch household. See, some of them were genuine marriages. Some of them were arrangements that suited both parties for reasons that had more to do with practicality than romance. See, I'm not looking for a wife, Gideon said. I know that, Callum said. See, but you're looking for a cook. And you need someone who can manage the household accounts and the supplies while you're out with the herd. See, you need someone capable. An advertisement is just a way to find a capable person. See, Gideon stared at him. A capable woman, Callum added. See, I heard you the first time. It doesn't have to be a real marriage. See, just needs to look like one. A woman who comes out here knowing what she's walking into and gets a home and security in exchange for the work. See, plenty of women in the East who've got nothing and need a way out as much as you need help. See, Gideon thought about that for a long time. Long enough that Callum put on his hat and started for the door, figuring the answer was no. See, write it for me, Gideon said, the advertisement. See, I can't just write it. Callum wrote it. He sent it to 3 papers, one in Chicago, one in St. Louis, and one in Kansas City. The notice said, rancher in Wyoming territory seeks capable woman, willing to take on frontier household management. See, honest arrangement, fair treatment, stable home. No deceptions on either side. See, Gideon had added that last sentence himself. Whatever this was going to be, he wasn't going to lie about it. See, 4 women wrote back. He read all 4 letters at the kitchen table with Callum sitting across from him. See, the first woman had 7 children she hadn't mentioned in her initial letter and expected the ranch to take all of them in. See, the second was primarily interested in whether the ranch was a Christian household, which she asked about in 4 separate paragraphs. See, the third wrote in a handwriting so shaky that Callum squinted at it for 2 full minutes before determining she was probably past 65 and dealing with a bad hand. See, the 4th letter was different. It was short. That was the first thing. See, most women writing to a stranger about marriage wrote long letters, because they understood they were trying to sell themselves, and they wanted to explain who they were and why they were worth the trouble. See, this 4th letter was half a page. It said, I have extensive experience with large-scale food preservation, butchering, smoking, curing, and kitchen management at commercial scale. See, I am not afraid of hard work or hard winters. I do not require comfort. See, I require honesty. If your arrangement is genuine and your situation is what you say it is, I am prepared to come west. See, send the fare, no name at the top. The signature at the bottom said only M. See, Bellamy. She didn't tell us anything about herself, Callum said. See, she told us exactly what matters, Gideon said. He sent the fare. See, he spent the 3 weeks before the stagecoach arrived telling himself that he was not nervous, which was a lie. See, he was not nervous about meeting a woman he'd met plenty of women in his life, had even been close to marrying one before the mountain years took him too far from anything settled. See, he was nervous because he had made a decision based on half a page of handwriting, and the last several decisions he'd made had cost him 11 head of cattle and most of his cash money. See, his judgment lately was not something he trusted entirely. See, the stagecoach from Casper came in on a Thursday afternoon, and Gideon stood outside the post office in Red Hollow with Callum beside him and watched it roll in. See, 4 passengers climbed down. A traveling salesman with 2 large cases. See, an older man who appeared to be a minister. A young couple who immediately embraced a family waiting near the road. See, and then last off the coach, a woman. She was not what he'd expected. See, he hadn't let himself expect anything specific, but whatever the unformed shape of his expectations had been, she wasn't it. See, she was in her early 30s, he guessed, dark-haired, and weathered in a way that wasn't from outdoor work, but from something older than that, the kind of weather that lives in a person, behind the eyes. See, she was not tall. She was not particularly striking. See, she wore a coat that had been good quality once, and a pair of boots that looked like they'd walked real distances. See, what she was pulling off the back of the coach, with the help of the driver, was a wooden trunk. See, big enough to be worth noticing. When they set it down, it made the sound of something heavy inside shifting. See, she walked toward him, without hesitating. She'd spotted him immediately, which told him she'd expected a rancher and known what one looked like. See, Gideon Rourke, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. See, Mara Bellamy. She looked at him steadily. She wasn't smiling. See, she wasn't nervous. Or if she was, she'd buried it somewhere he couldn't see. See, before we do anything else, I need to know the true state of your situation. See, not what's in the advertisement, the real numbers. See, Callum made a small sound beside him. Gideon looked at this woman who had traveled however far she'd traveled with a trunk full of something heavy, and he said, 22 men, 6 weeks without proper wages. See, 43 head of cattle, most of them underweight. See, $200 cash, $4,200 owed to a bank, due in 30 days. See, no cook, no winter food stores. He watched her face during all of that. See, she didn't flinch, she didn't look away. She absorbed the numbers the way a person absorbs something they'd already partly suspected. See, the smokehouse, she said. You have one? We do. See, haven't used it for much. Show it to me before we go inside. See, he didn't ask why. He just turned and led her toward the wagon where Callum and the driver were loading her trunk. See, she had one hand on the side of the wagon, and she was already looking west toward the mountains, reading the sky the way a sailor reads water. See, how long before the next hard weather? She asked. See, week, Callum said. Maybe 2 if we're lucky. She looked at the mountains for another few seconds. See, then she looked at Gideon. See, something moved across her face that wasn't quite a plan, and wasn't quite a decision, but was somewhere between the two, the look of a person who has just done arithmetic and arrived at an answer they don't fully like, but intend to use anyway. See, all right, she said. Then we don't have time to waste. See, she'd been off the stagecoach for approximately 4 minutes. See, they drove back to the ranch in a silence that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely uncomfortable. See, Gideon sat on the wagon bench and did not look at her, and she sat beside him and looked at everything: the road, the tree line, the fence condition, the shape of the land. See, he noticed that she was looking at the land the way he looked at it, the way a person looks at something they are already calculating the use of. See, not admiring it, working it out. When they pulled into the yard, she was off the wagon before he'd fully stopped, walking toward the smokehouse with her coat still buttoned. See, not waiting for him to show her where it was, she'd spotted it from the drive and was already heading for it. See, he jumped down and followed, which felt strange in a particular way he couldn't quite name, being on his own property and following someone else toward a building on it. See, she pushed the smokehouse door open and stood in the doorway. See, it was dark inside and it smelled like years of cold ash. See, the racks were old but solid. The fire pit was smaller than it should have been, but functional. See, old Pete had used it maybe twice a month for small batches. See, there was nothing commercial about it. Nothing that suggested what Mara Bellamy was apparently seeing when she looked at it, because her face changed. See, not dramatically, a small shift the way light changes on a hillside when a cloud moves. See, but it was there. How many cattle can you afford to lose, she said. See, Gideon leaned against the doorframe. Right now? None. See, I know that's your first answer, she said, not unkindly. See, I'm asking what the real number is. If you could lose 2 head but save the ranch, would you? See, he didn't answer immediately. Depends what saving the ranch means. See, it means this. See, she stepped inside the smokehouse. See, touched one of the old racks. See, tested its weight. See, looked at the ceiling height. See, looked at the fire pit. See, you slaughter 3 cattle. Not your best. Your weakest, the ones that aren't going to survive the winter anyway, and you probably already know which ones those are. See, we butcher them here. I cure the meat. We feed your 22 men properly for the first time in weeks, which means they can actually work, which means you have a functioning ranch instead of 22 men surviving on beans and resentment. See, and that saves the ranch how? She looked at him. See, that's the part I haven't finished explaining yet. See, he waited. You have a smokehouse, 3 cattle you're about to lose anyway, and the worst winter in memory closing every road in this territory. She said it like she was reading from something she could see, and he couldn't. See, every settlement between here and Casper is going to run short of food before spring. See, railroad camps, mining settlements, families who are already stretched thin. See, they are going to need preserved meat that can travel in the cold without spoiling. See, meat that's been properly smoked and cured and will keep for months. See, Gideon stared at her. You're not just feeding your men, she said. See, you're building a supply that this entire valley is going to need before February. See, on 3 cattle. To start, the wind shifted outside, and the smokehouse door moved on its hinges, and for a moment the only sound was that door creaking and the far-off sound of someone in the yard chopping wood. See, Gideon thought about the paper on his kitchen table. See, $4,200, 30 days. He thought about Silas Crowell's face when he'd said the number. See, not triumphant, exactly. Satisfied. The way a man looks when he's been patient a long time and the patience is finally paying off. See, he thought about Vernon Slade, who owned the 2nd largest spread in the valley and had been making quiet remarks for 2 years about Blackthorn's land and whether Rourke was really the right man to be holding it. See, he thought about 22 men who had stayed on at this ranch through 6 weeks without full wages because most of them had nowhere else to go and because they were, against all sense, loyal to him. See, he looked at Mara Bellamy standing in the ash-smelling darkness of an old smokehouse. See, talking about a plan that required him to slaughter the cattle he couldn't afford to lose and trust the judgment of a woman he'd known for approximately 20 minutes. See, you've done this before, he said. It wasn't a question. See, she paused. Just briefly. Commercial curing. Large-scale preservation. See, yes, he noticed the pause. He didn't comment on it. See, where, he said. Another pause, shorter this time. See, the Midwest. A packing operation. I managed the preservation side for several years. See, something in the way she said it was careful. Not dishonest, exactly, but careful. See, like a person working around a room in the dark, hands out, feeling for what's safe to touch. See, he decided not to push it. Not yet. He had 30 days and 22 hungry men and a banker waiting to take everything. And whatever Mara Bellamy's careful silences were about, she was here and she was the only plan he had. See, how long to set up properly, he said. She looked around the smokehouse one more time. See, 2 days to prepare the space. 3 cattle slaughtered over the first week. Work starts immediately after. See, you'll need to pull men off other work to help me. I'll need 6, minimum, and they need to be able to follow direction. See, they don't take direction from women, Callum said from the doorway. See, Gideon hadn't heard him come up. Callum was looking at Mara steadily, not unkindly but honestly. See, that's not judgment, that's just what you're walking into. See, Mara looked at Callum with the same level gaze she'd been giving everyone since she stepped off the stagecoach. See, then I'll need you to tell me which 6 are the least resistant to being wrong about something, she said. See, because every man in this yard is about to find out he's been wrong about what that smokehouse is worth, and I'd rather start with the ones who know how to learn from it. See, Callum blinked, and then slowly he smiled. It was the kind of smile a man produces when he's just been surprised by something in a way he didn't expect to be. See, he looked at Gideon. I like her, he said. You've known her 5 minutes, Gideon said. See, I know. Callum looked back at Mara, still like her. See, Gideon looked at the smokehouse. He looked at the mountains. See, he looked at the woman standing in the doorway of a plan she was already running in her head. See, and he thought about 30 days and $4,200 and 22 men and one banker who'd walked into his kitchen and left the door open behind him. See, he pushed off the doorframe and straightened up. 6 men, he said to Callum. See, your pick. Tell them they're on smokehouse detail starting tomorrow morning. See, he turned to Mara. What do you need for the first 2 days? See, she already had an answer. She'd had it ready before he'd finished asking. See, she reached into the coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, a list, written in a tight, precise hand, and held it out to him. See, he took it, looked at it. Salt, brown sugar, mountain sage, specific amounts of hardwood, rope, hooks, certain tools. See, at the bottom of the list, underlined, one decent fire that doesn't go out. See, he looked up from the paper and found her watching him with those careful, weather behind the eyes. See, I can do all of this, she said quietly, but I need you to trust me with 3 cattle you cannot afford to lose. See, and I need to know right now whether you're able to do that, because if you're not, I need to know before I unpack. See, the wind moved outside. Gideon Rourke thought about 15 years of building something in a place that didn't make building easy, and a banker who didn't knock, and 22 men eating beans for the 6th week running. See, unpack, he said, and that was how it started. The first morning, nobody listened to her. See, that wasn't a surprise. Mara had spent enough time in rooms full of men who'd already decided what she was worth to know that the first morning was always the hardest, and the worst thing you could do was show that it bothered you. See, so she didn't show it. She came into the yard before first light with her coat buttoned against the cold and her hair pulled back, and she went straight to the smokehouse. See, and when the 6 men Callum had assigned showed up late, 2 of them, not bothering to hide that they'd taken their time, she didn't say a word about it. See, she just handed the first man a rope and told him what she needed hung, and she pointed to where she needed the second fire pit dug out, and she set the third man to sorting the hardwood she'd had brought around from the woodpile. See, separating it by density and species the way she needed it separated. See, the men looked at each other. See, one of them, a broad-shouldered hand named Dex Whitlow, who had been at Blackthorn for 4 years and had a way of speaking that suggested he expected to be agreed with, looked at the rope she'd handed him and then looked at her. See, ma'am, he said, with respect, Pete did the smokehouse work around here, and Pete did it a certain way. See, Pete's dead, Mara said. Not cruelly, just factually. See, the way Pete did it won't get 22 men through winter. See, move the rope where I showed you. Dex Whitlow opened his mouth. See, if you have a better idea about curing 300 pounds of beef in a structure this size with 2 weeks before the next hard weather, she said, still not looking at him, already moving to the fire pit, I'm genuinely interested. See, otherwise the rope. Dex moved the rope. It wasn't one, not that morning. See, one morning never wins anything with men who've made up their minds. See, but it was started, which was something. Gideon watched from across the yard without making it obvious he was watching. See, he had work of his own, always had work. See, the kind of endless maintenance that a ranch in deteriorating condition demands, but he found himself near enough to the smokehouse, often enough, that Callum finally looked at him sideways around mid-morning and, see, said, You checking on her or checking on the men? See, checking on the smokehouse, Gideon said. Callum said nothing. See, he had known Gideon Rourke for 7 years, which was long enough to know what that kind of answer meant. See, what Gideon saw across those 2 days of preparation was something he hadn't been prepared for. See, he'd expected competence, her letter had promised competence, and nothing about Mara Bellamy so far had suggested she'd oversold herself. See, what he hadn't expected was the specific quality of how she worked. See, she didn't perform knowledge. She didn't explain herself to people who hadn't asked for explanation. See, she moved through the smokehouse with a kind of focused economy, no wasted motion, no second guessing, no steps he could identify as unnecessary. See, she knew where to put things before she put them there. See, she knew which problems were coming before they arrived. See, on the second afternoon, one of the hanging racks split along a joint it had been concealing for probably 2 seasons. See, it came down hard, knocked into a stack of curing salt she'd had arranged on a shelf, sent half of it across the floor. See, 2 of the men swore. One of them started to laugh, the short, uncomfortable laugh of someone watching a plan fall apart. See, Mara crouched down and started gathering the salt. See, she looked at the broken rack. She looked at the joint. See, she said calmly to a thin young hand named Cooper, who was nearest the woodpile, "Bring me 2 pieces of oak, 8 inches each, and whatever nails are in the left side of that toolbox." See, then she got up, still holding the salt she'd gathered in her hands, and went to find a container for it. See, Cooper had the oak and nails ready by the time she came back. See, she repaired the joint herself, braced it properly this time, tested it with her weight, and had the rack back in place inside 20 minutes. See, then she picked up where she'd left off as if nothing had happened. See, Dex Whitlow was watching that from the doorway. He didn't say anything. See, but he'd stopped looking at her the way he'd been looking at her on the first morning, and the difference was noticeable. See, by the 3rd day, the first cattle were slaughtered. See, Gideon had identified the 3 weakest in the herd he'd known, which ones they were since before Mara arrived, the way a man knows which trees are going to fall in the first real storm. See, he'd known and he'd been putting off the decision because making the decision felt like loss, and he'd already had so much of that lately. See, but he put on his work clothes, and he went out there, and he did what needed doing, and he didn't make it into more than it was. See, Mara was there for the butchering. She wasn't there to supervise, she was there to work. See, she knew how to take apart an animal with the same precision she'd brought to everything else. And watching her work, Gideon felt a specific kind of recognition that he'd felt only a handful of times in his life. See, the recognition of seeing someone who has learned their skill in real conditions, not in theory. See, her cuts were economical and correct. She talked while she worked, not constantly, but enough she explained what each cut was for, where it would go in the curing process, what the fat ratio meant for how it would smoke. See, she wasn't teaching for the sake of teaching. She was explaining because it was faster than having people do the wrong thing and having to redo it. See, the men listened. That was the thing Gideon noticed most. See, by the 3rd day, they were actually listening. The curing process started that afternoon. See, Gideon had assumed without really thinking about it that salting meat was salting meat. See, that curing was a simple process, something anyone with salt and time could manage. See, he discovered that he had known approximately nothing. See, Mara's mixture was specific. Salt, brown sugar in proportions she measured by weight rather than volume, crushed mountain sage that she'd had 2 of the men collect from the hillside, juniper berries that had to be cracked but not crushed. See, ground black pepper in a quantity he would have considered excessive, and something else, a dark, sharp-smelling herb he didn't recognize that she'd had in the trunk in a cloth-wrapped bundle. See, "What's that?" he asked. She looked up. "Something I've used for years. See, works better than anything I've found out here. Where'd you get it?" See, she went back to measuring. "I brought enough for 3 batches. See, after that, I'll need to substitute." He noticed that she hadn't answered the question. See, he noticed the same way he'd noticed the pause on the first day, when he'd asked where she'd done commercial work. See, he filed it away with the other things he'd noticed and didn't yet have a category for. See, the first batch of meat went into the curing mix that evening. See, the smokehouse fire was lit hardwood, built low and steady. The smoke kept thick, and even at the temperature Mara specified, and the waiting began. See, Mara spent the first night checking the fire every 2 hours because she'd said it needed to stay consistent, and she didn't trust anyone else to read it the way it needed to be read yet. See, Gideon woke at 2 in the morning and looked out his window and saw the faint orange glow from the smokehouse door and a silhouette in the doorway, and he lay back down and stared at the ceiling and thought about what he'd gotten himself into. See, he thought about it a long time before he slept. 7 days into the process, something shifted in the ranch. See, It wasn't dramatic. It happened the way most real shifts happen, without announcement. See, the men began organizing themselves around the smokehouse schedule without being told to. See, they'd built a rotation who was tending fire at what hour, who was handling which stage of the curing, and they'd built it themselves, which was the part that surprised Gideon. See, because getting 22 Wyoming ranch hands to organize voluntarily around any task not involving cattle or wages was not something he'd seen before. See, he mentioned it to Callum. Callum shrugged. They're eating better. See, it was true. The first cuts from the initial batch had come out 10 days in, and Mara had cooked a portion of it that night, not the cured product, which needed more time. See, but fresh, smoked beef that was already better than anything the ranch had produced since Pete died. See, the men had eaten in the way men eat when they've been underfed for weeks completely and fast, and with a silence that was the closest thing to reverence that cowboys tended to manage. See, after supper, one of the older hands, a lean, quiet man named Alton, who had been at Blackthorn longer than anyone except Gideon, had pushed back from the table and looked down the table toward where Mara was eating and said, without preamble, "See, ma'am, that's the finest beef I've had in this territory." See, it wasn't a dramatic compliment. It was delivered in Alton's flat, matter-of-fact way, the same way he reported weather or fence damage. See, but it landed in the room with a particular weight, because Alton was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and everyone at the table knew that. See, Mara had looked up. She'd nodded once. "Thank you, Alton." See, that was all. But something changed at that table. See, Gideon could feel it the way you can feel when a room's temperature shifts without being able to point to the exact moment it happened. See, he caught her eye briefly across the table, and she looked away before he could read her expression, and he went back to his food and thought about nothing in particular. See, on the 14th day, she started talking about Blackthorn Reserve. See, she brought it up after supper, with Gideon and Callum at the kitchen table, the way she brought up most things, directly and without prelude. See, she had a piece of paper with her, numbers written in that same tight, precise hand. See, the preserved product will be ready in another 2 weeks, she said. See, at which point we'll have enough to supply this ranch through February, with surplus. See, good, Gideon said. The surplus is what I want to talk about. She set the paper on the table between them. See, the Hartley Railroad camp is 6 miles north. See, they're running low on everything already. One of their supply wagons came through Red Hollow last week asking about stores, and Walt Beeman at the general store couldn't help them because Walt barely has enough for the town. See, the Morrison mining settlement is 12 miles east. See, there are 3 homestead families between here and the Casper Road who are going to be in real trouble if this winter closes the roads early. See, Callum looked at the paper. He was quiet for a moment. See, you want to sell to them. I want to sell the preserved product to them, Mara said. See, not raw beef, not anything they can get anywhere else. See, smoked brisket, jerky, cured cuts packed for transport. See, things that will travel 15 miles in a saddlebag in January without spoiling. See, things that will keep a camp or a family fed for 3 weeks without refrigeration. She looked at Gideon. See, if we charge the right price, the railroad camp alone could clear a significant part of what you owe Crowell. See, the room was quiet except for the fire. Gideon looked at the paper. See, he looked at the numbers. They were in her handwriting, which he'd learned in 2 weeks was never careless. If she'd written a number down, she'd worked it out first. See, he didn't understand all the calculations, but he understood the bottom line, because she'd underlined it. Estimated revenue, first sales, railroad and mining settlements, 1,400, 1,800, depending on negotiation. See, his eyes went to Callum. Callum was looking at the paper with an expression that Gideon recognized as the one he made when he thought something was smarter than he wanted to admit. See, Blackthorn Reserve, Callum said slowly. That's what you want to call it. See, it needs a name, Mara said. If it's going to be sold, it's a product. See, a product needs a name people remember. Where'd that come from? Gideon asked. See, she considered the question briefly. The ranch is Blackthorn Valley. See, the product should carry that. It's a promise you're telling someone that what they're buying comes from a specific place with a specific standard. See, when they eat it and it's good, they remember the name. See, next time the railroad foreman needs supplies, he asks for Blackthorn Reserve by name. See, Gideon sat with that for a moment. It was the kind of thinking he hadn't done, couldn't have done, probably, because his entire mental energy for the past month had been consumed by the immediate crisis of feeding men and avoiding foreclosure. See, she was thinking past the immediate crisis. She was thinking about what came after. See, what do we need to scale up, he said. She'd expected the question. See, she had a second list ready. More salt, more hardwood, additional hanging capacity in the smokehouse. She'd already identified 2 ways to expand without building new structures. See, 3 more cattle, the next weakest in the herd, to be slaughtered in stages to keep the supply consistent. See, 2 more men on smokehouse rotation, and a wagon, she said. See, reinforced with a proper cover for transport. We have a wagon. See, not one I'd trust to do this job in January weather, she said without apology. See, the undercarriage on the left side is worn. If it breaks on the Casper Road in a blizzard, we lose the load and probably the horse. See, he hadn't known about the undercarriage. He almost asked how she'd noticed it, then decided not to. See, she noticed things. He was beginning to understand that about her, the way you understand something that doesn't quite have a name yet. See, I'll have it looked at, he said. The problem was that none of this was free. See, expanding the curing operation required money they didn't have, which was the same problem the ranch had started with, and the fact that they now had a plan didn't change the math of the immediate situation. See, Gideon spent 2 days working the numbers himself, which he was not as good at as he would have liked to be. See, and eventually sat down with Callum and admitted that the expansion required them to defer wages 1 more week and use the last of the cash reserves for supplies. See, men aren't going to like that, Callum said. No, Gideon said. See, I know. You want me to tell them? Gideon thought about it. See, no, I'll do it. He gathered the men at supper. He stood at the end of the table, and he told them straight, no softening, no elaborate explanation. See, 1 more week on wages. The money was going into supplies for the smokehouse expansion. See, he explained what Mara had laid out, the sales plan, the numbers, what it could mean for the ranch's future. See, he didn't promise anything because he'd been taught early that promises made in desperation were debts you couldn't always pay. See, the table was quiet when he finished. Then Dex Whitlow-Dex, who'd been the first one to push back on Mara's first morning, who'd needed to be told twice to move the rope, said, "How much can we make on the railroad camp alone?" See, Gideon told him the number. Dex looked at the man beside him. See, looked back at Gideon, nodded slowly. "All right," he said. See, 1 more week. Nobody else argued, not out loud. See, Gideon knew there were doubts could read them, in the quality of the silence, in the way some of the men kept their eyes down. See, but they stayed, and that night, unprompted, 3 of the men who weren't on smokehouse rotation volunteered to extend their shifts. See, they just showed up. Mara was at the smokehouse at midnight, checking the fire, and she found those 3 men there already, and she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at them. See, and then she went inside without comment and showed them what to watch for and how to read the temperature by the color of the smoke, the way she'd been doing it herself. See, the night the fire started, nobody was prepared. See, it was the 3rd week of November, and the weather had been building all day in the way that Wyoming weather builds slowly, with intention, the sky getting that particular flat gray color that meant business. See, the men had been running the smokehouse in double shifts to get the second batch completed before the next storm hit. See, and everyone was tired in the specific way that combines physical exhaustion with the low-grade anxiety of watching a deadline approach. See, Gideon was in the barn at 10:30 when he heard someone shout. See, not a word, just the sound, that short, sharp exclamation that means something has gone wrong faster than language can describe it. See, he was out the barn door before the sound finished. See, The oil fire had caught the base of the smokehouse on the eastern wall, fed by something that burned faster and hotter than wood he could smell it, the particular acrid quality that meant accelerant. See, it was already climbing the dry timber, and the wind that had been building all day picked it up immediately, and for approximately 4 seconds, Gideon stood in the yard watching the fire and thinking that they were going to lose everything. See, then he was moving. He was shouting before he knew what he was shouting: names, instructions, pull from the well, wet sacking. Everyone not carrying water, get the product out of there. Don't let the interior catch, and the yard erupted. See, men came from the bunkhouse half-dressed, from the barn, from the kitchen. See, Callum was at the well before Gideon got there, already working the handle, already filling the first bucket. See, Mara was at the smokehouse door, not running away from it. See, at the door, pulling it open, pulling the hanging racks of cured meat back from the eastern wall, further into the structure, away from where the fire was climbing outside. See, she was in there when the wall was burning, and Gideon shouted at her to get out, and she either didn't hear him or chose not to, because she kept moving, kept pulling things back, kept repositioning what could be repositioned. See, he was the one who went in after her. See, he got her arm, and she pulled against him instinctively, the way a person pulls against an unexpected grip, and he said in her ear, close enough that she could hear him over the fire and the shouting, "The wall's going to go." See, we need to be out in 60 seconds. She looked at the eastern wall. See, she looked at what she'd moved. See, she did the math. He could see her doing it, see the specific calculation happening behind her eyes, and then she let him pull her toward the door. But she grabbed 2 wrapped bundles from a high shelf on the way out, things she'd packed herself. See, and she didn't drop them even as they came through the door into the cold air and the smoke and the organized chaos of 22 men throwing water at a burning wall. See, they got it. It took 40 minutes and most of the water in 2 full troughs and every piece of wet sacking the ranch owned, and the eastern wall was badly charred and would need to be rebuilt, and 1 section of interior rack was destroyed. See, but the product was saved. The smokehouse was standing. See, the fire was out. See, in the aftermath. See, men stood in the yard breathing hard. See, faces black from smoke. See, saying nothing. See, the kind of silence that follows something that almost went the other way. See, Gideon looked at the wall. He looked at Mara, who was standing a few feet away, still holding the 2 bundles she'd grabbed on the way out, her coat singed along one sleeve, her face streaked with soot. See, you could have been in there when that wall went, he said. See, I know, she said. That was a bad decision. She looked at him. See, her eyes were steady, but there was something in them that wasn't steadiness, something that had been shaken and was working to resettle itself. See, I know, she said again. The product needed to be moved. See, the product isn't worth your life. She didn't answer that. See, she looked down at the bundles in her arms, and something crossed her face that was too complicated and too quick for him to catch fully. See, then she looked back at the scorched wall. This wasn't an accident, she said. See, he'd known it the moment he smelled the accelerant. See, no oil fire on the outside base of the wall. That's not an ember from the fire pit. See, that's set deliberately. She said it quietly, not dramatically, just as a fact being stated. See, someone wants this operation stopped. Callum appeared at Gideon's shoulder. See, he'd heard. He looked at the wall, then at both of them. See, I'll do a count in the morning. Who was supposed to be where tonight? See, it took Callum less than 1 full day. See, by the following evening, see, he had the name. See, Rafe Dugan. See, a hand who'd been with the ranch for 8 months and who had been notably absent from the firefighting effort the night before, and notably unable to explain where he'd been during the relevant hour. See, Callum had found the oil-stained cloth in Rafe's saddlebag, which was either the most careless piece of evidence concealment in Wyoming history or the act of a man who hadn't expected to be found out. See, Gideon brought Rafe into the barn, just the 2 of them, which was a choice. He could have made it a public thing in front of the men, but he'd decided against it. See, not out of mercy, out of wanting information before anything else. See, Rafe didn't deny it for long. He held out through the first 5 minutes of silence, which was a technique Gideon had learned years ago in situations where he needed a man to understand exactly how serious the moment was. See? Then Rafe broke not with drama, not with tears, just with the flat deflation of a man who's carrying something too heavy and finally sets it down. See, Vernon Slade had approached him 6 weeks ago. $40 to keep an eye on Blackthorn and report back. See, another $60 if the smokehouse operation failed before it could get properly started. See, $60. That was the price of 22 men's winter food supply. See, that was the price of everything Mara had been building for 3 weeks. See, Gideon stood very still when Rafe said the number. See, he had a specific feeling that he couldn't quite call anger. It was quieter than anger, and colder, and in some ways more dangerous than anger. See, it was the feeling of understanding exactly who wanted him to fail, and exactly how much they were willing to spend to make it happen, and what that told him about how serious the situation was going to get. See, he told Rafe to collect his things and be off Blackthorn property by sunrise. See, he said it once clearly without raising his voice. See, Rafe started to say something else, whether it was an apology or an explanation or something else. Gideon never found out because he left the barn before Rafe could finish the sentence. See, he found Mara in the smokehouse, assessing the damage to the eastern wall with a lantern held up close to the charred timbers. See, she heard him come in but didn't turn around. Slade, he said. See, she lowered the lantern, turned to look at him. How much did he pay? See, $60 to stop the smokehouse. Something moved across her face. See, not surprised she hadn't expected it to be accidental. She had said so the night before. See, but something harder than surprise. Something that had the particular quality of confirmation, which is its own kind of pain. See, the kind you get when you were hoping you were wrong about someone. See, he's watching this operation, she said. He's been watching it since I arrived, probably. See, he knows what this can become. He knows what this can become before it becomes it, Gideon said. See, which means he knows it's working. She looked back at the charred wall. See, she ran one hand along the damage, testing it, assessing structure the way she assessed everything, through direct contact. See, the wall can be rebuilt in 3 days. The damaged rack can be replaced. See, we lost a partial batch, but the main product survived. She turned back to him. See, this doesn't stop us. No, Gideon said, but it won't be the last thing he tries. See, no. She held the lantern up again, looking at the ceiling, checking for hidden damage in the structure above the fire line. See, her face in the lantern light was composed and serious, and marked with soot she hadn't yet washed off. See, the singed sleeve of her coat was dark against the light. See, Gideon had an impulse to say something. He wasn't sure what. Exactly not something sentimental. He wasn't built for that, and anyway the moment didn't call for it. See, what he wanted to say was something closer to, I understand now why you came west. See, I don't know the full story yet, but I understand that you came here running from something, and you still went into that burning building for the product, and I don't know what that means exactly, but I think it means something. See, he didn't say any of that. What he said was, I'll get men started on the wall tomorrow morning. See, good, she said. We need the second batch finished before the roads close. See, he nodded, started to leave, stopped, half turned back, and said without quite looking at her, you shouldn't have stayed in there as long as you did. See, a pause, then quietly, I know, but I'm glad the product survived. See, another pause shorter. He thought he heard something in her breath, not quite a laugh, not quite anything else. See, so am I, she said. He left her there with the lantern, standing in the building that was still standing despite everything someone had paid to knock it down. See, and he walked back across the yard in the cold night air and thought about Vernon Slade sitting in his comfortable ranch house 6 miles away, probably waiting to hear that it had worked. See, it hadn't worked. And there was something taking shape at Blackthorn Valley that Slade had understood before Gideon had something that Mara had seen from the moment she stood in the doorway of an ash-smelling smokehouse on the day she arrived. See, Gideon was starting to see it too, now more clearly than he had. See, not just survival, not just getting through the winter and paying off Crowell and keeping the ranch alive. See, something bigger than that. The roads were going to close. See, the worst winter anyone in this territory could remember was already coming. You could feel it in the air, in the behavior of the animals, in the way the cold settled at night, with a particular permanence that the old-timers read as a sign. See, when those roads closed, every settlement between here and Casper was going to run out of food. See, every railroad camp, every mining settlement, every isolated family that had pushed the edge of what they could store. See, and Blackthorn Valley's smokehouses would be full. See, Gideon stood in the yard and looked at the patched, fire-scared smokehouse and felt the shape of what was coming, and for the first time in a month and a half, what he felt when he looked at it wasn't desperation. See, it was something else, something adjacent to hope but made of sterner material, something that didn't require the future to be certain before it was worth working toward. See, inside the smokehouse, the fire burned steady and low, the way Mara had taught the men to keep it. See, the smoke rose even and clean into the cold Wyoming night. See, the second batch was almost done. The eastern wall of the smokehouse took 3 days to rebuild, just as Mara had said it would. See, the men worked on it in the cold without being asked twice, which told Gideon something about how the fire had changed things. See, there is a particular effect that sabotage has on a group of people who were already working hard. It doesn't discourage them the way an outside threat might expect it to. See, it makes them angry in a focused, productive way. It makes the thing they're working on feel worth protecting. See, nobody talked about Rafe Dugan much after he rode out. See, a few of the men had known him reasonably well, and those men were quiet for a day or two in the way that people are quiet when they discover that someone they trusted was being paid to work against them. See, then they went back to work because there wasn't anything else useful to do with the feeling. See, the second batch came out of the curing process 4 days after the fire, and it was different from the first. See, better. Mara had adjusted the sage ratio slightly and added a longer cold smoke phase at the end that Gideon hadn't understood the purpose of until he tasted the result. See, the flavor had a depth to it that was hard to describe, not complicated, not the kind of food that required thinking about, but the kind that made you set down your fork for a second and just register what you were eating. See, Alton, who had given Mara her first real compliment at that table weeks ago, tried a piece of the smoked brisket and was quiet for a long moment. See, that's different, he said. Cold smoke at the end, Mara said. See, drops the temperature and closes the exterior, extends preservation and changes the flavor profile. See, Alton looked at the piece in his hand. How long will it keep? See, properly packed? 4 months. Maybe 5 if the winter stays cold enough to help. See, he looked up at her. You could sell this in Denver. See, eventually, she said. First we sell it 6 miles north. See, the road to the Hartley Railroad camp was bad even in good weather, a rutted track through pine and scrub that followed the creek bed and crossed it twice at fords that were navigable in summer and treacherous in November. See, Gideon had the wagon undercarriage repaired 2 days before the first delivery run. Because Mara had been right about it, she'd been right about most things so far, and he'd stopped being surprised by that and started just acting on it. See, he drove the first wagon himself. Mara sat beside him. See, Callum rode alongside on horseback with 2 other armed men, because the road between Blackthorn and the railroad camp passed through a section of valley that Gideon had never entirely trusted. See, and that was before Rafe Dugan had demonstrated that Vernon Slade was willing to pay for interference. See, they arrived at the Hartley camp in mid-morning. It was a rougher settlement than Gideon remembered from the summer 40 men living in a combination of constructed barracks and heavy canvas. See, deep in the kind of cold that railroad work in Wyoming generates, which is its own specific category of miserable. See, the foreman, a stocky Irishman named Cormac Farrell, came out of the main building when the wagon rolled in and looked at them with the expression of a man who has been hoping for something to arrive and is still not sure this is it. See, Rourke, he said, heard you had problems this fall. See, had some, Gideon said. Worked through them. Farrell looked at the wagon. Looked at the covered load. What've you got? Mara climbed down from the wagon bench before Gideon answered. She pulled back the canvas covering and unwrapped one of the sample packages she'd prepared. Smoked brisket, sliced, wrapped in paper, and then in cloth, labeled in her handwriting with the weight and the cure date. She held it out to Farrell. Try it. Farrell looked at the package. Looked at her. He had the expression of a man who was not accustomed to women handing him things and telling him to try them, but he took it, unwrapped it, and bit into a slice. He chewed. His expression shifted in the way that Gideon had now seen 3 times that specific recalibration that happened when someone encountered Mara's cured beef for the first time. Farrell finished chewing. He looked at the package in his hand. He looked at the wagon. Then he looked at Mara. How much? That depends on how much you need and how reliable you want the supply to be, she said. If you're buying for this week, one price. If you're committing to a monthly supply through February, I'll guarantee the quantity and reduce the rate. Farrell narrowed his eyes. You're a provisioner? I'm the person who made what you just ate, Mara said. What I am is less relevant than whether you want more of it. Farrell almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but it was close. He looked at Gideon. She always like this? Since I've known her, Gideon said. Farrell bought enough for a monthly commitment through February. He paid the first installment in cash, which Gideon folded into his coat pocket and tried not to think about too hard, because thinking about it made his hands want to shake slightly. And he was not a man who allowed his hands to shake where anyone could see it. On the drive back, Mara did not celebrate. She sat on the wagon bench with her coat pulled close and looked at the road ahead and worked through something in her head that Gideon couldn't see. After a while, she said, the Morrison settlement next. But we need to increase production before we can commit to another monthly account. We need more cattle, Gideon said. Yes, which I don't have. She was quiet for a moment. The Hendersons, she said. The Homestead family 6 miles east. They've got breeding stock they haven't been able to sell because the market dried up when the early winter hit. They need cash. We need cattle. It's a straightforward arrangement. You know about the Henderson cattle. Cooper mentioned them. His family and the Hendersons came out from the same county in Kansas. She said it without particular emphasis, just as information, the way she conveyed most things. He said they had 12 head they were hoping to sell before winter and couldn't find a buyer. Gideon thought about it. 12 head from the Hendersons, paid for with a portion of the Hartley money, would give them enough to expand the production to cover the Morrison settlement and potentially 2 or 3 of the isolated homesteads on the Eastern Road. It meant using money that had just come in almost immediately before they'd fully had it, which required a specific kind of discipline that he was still getting accustomed to, the discipline of reinvesting rather than holding. Of trusting the next step rather than securing the last one. All right, he said. I'll ride out to the Hendersons tomorrow. Take Cooper, she said. His connection helps, he did. And the Hendersons sold gratefully because cash money in November in that territory was not something people turned away from, and the 12 cattle came to Blackthorn 2 days later and changed the math of everything Mara had been calculating. Then the real winter arrived. It didn't announce itself the way the early October blizzard had. It came in quietly over 3 days, a deepening cold that started to feel different from anything that had come before, not just cold but permanent. The kind of cold that settles into the ground and the timber and the air itself and makes clear that it isn't going anywhere until it decides to. The temperature dropped to levels the Callum, who had been in Wyoming for 12 years, said he hadn't seen since he was a young man. The roads began to close, not all at once one by one, as the drifts built up in the cuts and passes and the creek crossings became impassable. Within 2 weeks, Red Hollow and everything within 20 miles of it was cut off from Casper. The railroad line was still running, barely, but the supply wagons that kept the camps and settlements stocked couldn't make it through. Walt Beeman's General Store, which served as the unofficial hub of what Red Hollow needed to survive the winter, sent word out to every ranch in the valley that he was running low on staples and couldn't say when resupply would come. See, and the requests started coming to Blackthorn. Not customers. See, not at first. Desperate people. The railroad camp sent a rider on the third week of December saying they were already burning through their supply faster than expected and needed more before February. See, a rider from the Morrison settlement came through on a Tuesday morning half-frozen, asking if Blackthorn had anything to spare for cash or trade. See, a homestead family 7 miles north sent their eldest son, he couldn't have been more than 16, to ask about buying preserved meat in whatever quantity Blackthorn could manage. See, Mara handled all of them. Not Gideon, she'd taken over the commercial conversations naturally, in the way she'd taken over most things. See, not by claiming authority, but by being the one who knew the numbers and the supply and the logistics in the specific detail that conversations like these required. See, Gideon sat in on some of them, because it was his ranch and his name, and he needed to understand what was being agreed to. See, but he'd stopped trying to lead the conversations, because he'd seen enough to understand that when Mara was across a table from someone who needed something Blackthorn had, things went better if he didn't interrupt. See, the railroad foreman, Farrell, sent a second man with the December rider. See, this man wasn't a rider, he was better dressed, and he had the manner of someone who dealt in quantities rather than individual transactions. See, his name was Hobart, and he represented not just the Hartley camp, but 3 additional railroad stations that were working the same line and facing the same shortage. See, he sat at Gideon's kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon and said carefully that he was authorized to purchase significant quantities of preserved beef at a premium rate if Blackthorn could guarantee delivery and quality. See, he named a price per hundredweight that was nearly double what they'd been charging Farrell. See, Mara looked at the number. She did not react to it visibly, which Gideon had come to understand meant she was working out whether it was the right number or whether it was a negotiating position. See, we can guarantee quality, she said. The delivery timeline depends on road conditions, which neither of us controls. See, we can commit to best effort with a partial penalty structure if we fall short on timing. See, Hobart blinked. He'd been expecting either a simple yes or a counteroffer on price. See, he hadn't expected a delivery clause. That's a fairly sophisticated arrangement for a ranch provisioner. See, is it a workable one? A pause. It's workable. See, then the price is 12% higher than what you offered. See, Hobart opened his mouth. You're buying supply security in a closed road winter, Mara said. See, that has a value beyond the weight of the product. See, your camps don't go hungry. Your workers keep working. See, your railroad keeps moving. The 12% is what that's worth. See, Hobart was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Gideon as if expecting Gideon to moderate this. See, Gideon said nothing. Hobart looked back at Mara, and then, with the slightly stunned expression of a man who has just been out-negotiated in someone's kitchen, he said, 12%. See, when he left, Gideon sat at the table and looked at the number written on the paper Mara had slid across to Hobart during the negotiation. See, he looked at it for a while, then he looked at her. See, where did you learn to do that? He said. She was stacking the papers from the negotiation, organizing them by date the way she organized everything. See, she didn't look up immediately. Commercial operations, she said, in that same careful tone she used when the answer touched on something she wasn't ready to open fully. See, you learn quickly what things are worth when someone else has been telling you they're worth less than they are. See, he sat with that. There was something in the way she'd said it, something personal threaded through the professional explanation that suggested the lesson hadn't been academic. See, someone had told her what her work was worth, and that person had been wrong, and she'd learned the right number through a more difficult process than classroom instruction. See, he didn't push. He'd gotten better at not pushing with her. See, the information that mattered would come when it came. See, outside, the cold had locked down another degree. The drifts in the yard were past knee height now, and the men had beaten a path from the bunkhouse to the smokehouse that was the most important road on the property. See, they ran the fires around the clock in shifts of 3 hours, because longer than that in this cold, even tending a smokehouse fire, was more than any reasonable person should ask of anyone. See, nobody complained. That was the thing Gideon kept coming back to when he lay awake in the early morning hours, listening to the wind. See, 22 men, living on reduced wages, working longer hours than their contract specified, in conditions that were objectively miserable, and nobody was demanding to leave. See, he'd had men leave over less in better years. He'd had good hands walk off over a bad batch of Cook's biscuits in a mild October. See, he mentioned it to Callum one night, not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation, something he couldn't quite account for. See, Callum thought about it. They know what's in those smokehouses, he said finally. See, they built it, they smelled it and tasted it, and stayed up at night keeping the fires going. See, when Dugan tried to burn it down, they fought the fire at midnight in their long johns. He looked at Gideon. See, a man works hard enough for something long enough, and it becomes his. See, doesn't matter whose name's on the deed. Gideon thought about that for a long time after Callum said it. See, the wagon runs were brutal. There was no other word for it. See, the roads that were still passable were worse than bad deep drifted in some sections, sheet ice in others. The creek crossings hazardous enough that Gideon insisted on roping the wagon to lead horses on each side through the worst of them. See, each run to a settlement took 2 to 3 times as long as it would have in normal weather. See, and they lost one wagon wheel to a hidden rock in mid-December and had to offload the product into the snow and repair the wheel on the road before they could continue. See, Mara rode on the first 3 wagon runs. Gideon told her she didn't need to, that Callum could handle the deliveries, that there was no reason for her to be in an open wagon in that weather. See, she listened to this with the polite attention she gave to suggestions she had already decided not to follow. See, I negotiate the terms, she said. When we arrive at a settlement with a delivery and a problem wrong quantity, damage, something they weren't expecting, I need to be there to handle it directly. See, I can't fix a customer relationship from back here. See, you could freeze to death on that road. You've made that run 4 times in the last 3 weeks, she said. See, you haven't frozen yet. I'm built different. She looked at him with a very specific expression that he'd started to recognize, the one that appeared when she thought he'd said something that required patience to respond to. See, I'm wearing the same coat as Callum, and I've survived harder cold than this, she said. See, I'm going. He didn't argue further. He'd learned, in a process that was neither comfortable nor particularly fast, that there was a category of Mara Bellamy's decisions that were not actually discussions. See, and that the most productive use of his energy was learning to tell those from the ones that were open to input. See, she didn't freeze. She handled 2 customer problems on those first 3 runs of settlement that had expected a larger quantity than what the paperwork showed. See, which turned out to be a miscommunication in the original negotiation that Mara resolved on site by offering a credit toward the February delivery. See, and a camp cook who complained that the smoked brisket was saltier than what they'd received in November, which Mara addressed by explaining the difference in cure time between the 2 batches, and which the cook then tried to argue with, and lost. See, because he was attempting to out-knowledge someone who had spent a decade in commercial meat preservation. See, by January, the money was real. That was how Gideon thought of it, not that it was unreal before, but that in December it had still felt like a plan, like numbers on paper, like the kind of thing that might still dissolve if the wrong wind blew. See, in January it became real in the most concrete way possible, cash money, in enough quantity that Gideon put it in the tin box under his bed and then moved it to a locked box in the ranch house because the tin box wasn't adequate anymore. See, on the 15th of January, he paid Callum and every man on the ranch their full back wages. See, 6 weeks of arrears, paid in full in cash. He did it at the supper, putting each man's envelope beside his plate before anyone sat down, and then he sat at the head of the table and waited. See, The men came in, cold from the evening shift, and saw the envelopes. See, there was a silence of the particular quality that happens when people encounter something they'd stopped fully expecting. See, Dex Whitlow picked up his envelope and looked inside and said nothing for a moment that lasted about 5 seconds too long. See, this is all of it, Dex said. All of it, Gideon said. See, plus the current month, which is already a week in. See, Dex looked down the table at Mara, who was sitting in her usual place, eating, not making a production of the moment. See, he looked at her for a moment in a way that contained everything he hadn't said in the 6 weeks since she'd arrived and told him where to put the rope. See, then he looked back down at his envelope. All right, he said. See, the same 2 words he'd said the night Gideon had asked for 1 more week. See, but with a different weight under them now. On the 22nd of January, Gideon paid Silas Crowell. See, he rode into Red Hollow on a clear, brutal morning with the temperature low enough to make the horses breath fog in continuous white clouds. See, and he went to Crowell's bank and he put $4,200 in cash on the counter in front of Crowell's clerk and asked for a receipt. See, the clerk, who was young enough to be visibly uncertain how to handle this, went to get Crowell himself. See, Crowell came out of the back office and looked at the money on the counter. See, he looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who is recalculating something he thought was already calculated. See, full payment, Gideon said. Balance and current interest. See, I'd like a receipt showing the account is settled. See, Crowell looked at him. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite what Gideon had expected. He'd expected frustration, or the specific displeasure of a man whose plan has been disrupted. See, what he saw instead was more complicated than that. See, something that might have been genuine surprise underneath the professional composure. See, you've had a profitable winter, Crowell said. We have, Gideon said. See, receipt, please. He waited while the receipt was written. See, he folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket, close to his chest where he could feel it. See, and he rode back to Blackthorn in the cold January air with the particular feeling of a man who has just removed something very heavy from somewhere it had been sitting for a long time. See, when he got back to the ranch, Mara was in the smokehouse. See, she was always in the smokehouse. See, or going to it. See, or coming from it. See, or calculating something related to it. See, he stood in the doorway and watched her check the temperature by color and smell the way she'd taught the men to do it, and when she noticed him, she looked at him and waited. See, he took the receipt out of his coat pocket and held it up. See, she looked at it. Her face did something he hadn't seen it do before, not a smile exactly, because Mara Bellamy's face didn't go directly to smiles the way some people's did. See, it was a release of something, a very slight easing around the eyes, something that had been held at tension for a long time coming briefly loose. See, settled, she said. Settled. She nodded once and went back to checking the fire. See, he stood in the doorway a moment longer than he needed to. See, there was something he'd been aware of for several weeks that he hadn't addressed directly, even in his own thinking, because addressing it directly meant deciding what to do about it, and he hadn't been ready to decide. See, the awareness that what existed between him and Mara Bellamy was no longer accurately described by the arrangement they'd agreed to in the courtyard of the Red Hollow post office. See, the arrangement had been practical. She would manage the household and the preservation operation. He would provide the home and the resources. See, and both of them would call it a marriage, because the territory required it to be called something, and a marriage was the most honest name available. See, what it had become over 3 months of shared crisis was something the original arrangement didn't have a name for. See, they'd worked through enough together that the professional vocabulary had started developing gaps in it, places where something more personal was leaking in at the edges. See, he noticed where she was in the yard without meaning to. See, he registered when she'd skipped a meal because the smokehouse needed her attention and felt something that was adjacent to irritation about it, which was not a feeling he'd expected to develop about anyone. See, when she'd been in the burning smokehouse longer than she should have been, he'd gone in after her, not because it was the rational thing to do, but because the alternative wasn't something he could process. See, he didn't say any of this. He turned up his collar against the cold coming in through the open door and went to find Callum to give him the news about Crowell. See, but he didn't go straight to Callum. He walked a slightly longer route through the yard than was necessary, past the new sections of Curing House, where he'd had men laying brick all week. See, past the repaired eastern wall of the original smokehouse, with its new timber still pale against the older weathered boards. See, he looked at what 3 months of Mara Bellamy's presence had done to this property that had been collapsing in October, and he let himself look at it honestly. See, this was the last week of January, and the smokehouses were full, and the debt was gone, and 22 men had their wages, and somewhere out there, Vernon Slade was watching all of it and had not yet made his next move. See, that last part was the one that sat uneasily. Slade hadn't responded to having his hired man driven off the property. See, he hadn't come to Blackthorn, hadn't sent a message, hadn't done anything visible. See, in Gideon's experience, powerful men who wanted something and didn't get it, on the first attempt didn't give up, they regrouped, and the silence that followed a failed attempt was usually the most dangerous period. See, he mentioned it to Mara that evening. She was at the kitchen table with her account books, the columns of numbers she kept with the same precision she kept everything. See, she listened to him without stopping writing. "He's waiting to see if we survive the winter," she said. See, once the roads open in spring and the railroad supply comes back, our advantage narrows. See, we're valuable right now because we have what nobody else can get in. See, come April that changes. So we have a window. We have a window, she confirmed. See, we need to use it to become something that's worth keeping through April and beyond. See, not a winter survival story, an actual commercial operation. See, more curing houses, Gideon said, more curing houses. See, a proper wagon fleet, contracts that extend past spring, not just winter emergency purchases. She set down her pen and looked at him. See, the railroad account is the key. Hobart isn't just buying our meat. See, he's buying the idea that Blackthorn is a reliable supplier. See, if we can convert the emergency winter relationship into a standing contract before the snow melts, we have something Slade can't disrupt with a hired man and a bottle of lamp oil. See, and if we can't, she looked at him steadily, then we're a ranch that had a good winter and needs to figure out what's next. She picked up the pen again. See, so let's make sure it's not that. Outside, the wind had picked up again. See, the Wyoming winter that everyone in Red Hollow had agreed was the worst in memory had at least 2 more months in it, and those 2 months contained everything Mara had been working toward: the conversion, the expansion. See, the shift from desperate improvisation to something that could hold its shape when the weather changed, and the roads opened, and the world came back in. See, Gideon sat down across from her at the table, which was not something he'd done without a specific agenda before, and he said, "Show me the numbers." See, she looked up from the account book. The lamp between them made the light specific and close. See, all of them, she said. "Start from the beginning," he said. See, "I want to understand what you're building." She studied him for a moment. See, then she turned the account book to face him and moved the lamp so he could see it better, and she started from the first column, the one that began in late October, with 3 cattle and a smokehouse full of old ash. See, and she walked him through every step of what she'd done and what it had produced and what it could still become. See, he listened. See, he asked questions. See, some of them obvious. See, some of them less so. See, and she answered without impatience. See, the fire in the hearth burned down while they talked. See, one of the men knocked on the door around 9 to report that the north fence had a post down, and Gideon told him they'd deal with it in the morning without looking up from the account book. See, the wind moved outside and the lamp flame bent slightly. See, at some point they stopped talking about numbers and started talking about other things. See, he wasn't sure exactly when the transition happened. See, she talked about the Morrison Settlement's cook, who had argued with her about the salt, and then sent a note 3 weeks later asking for her recipe for the rub mix, which she had not sent because the rub was blackthorns. See, he told her about the first time he'd crossed the Wyoming border at 23, heading west with no particular plan, and how he'd ended up with a ranch by a combination of intention and accident that he still hadn't fully sorted out. See, you didn't plan to be here, she said. I planned to be somewhere, he said. See, here was what happened. She looked at the table. See, I know that feeling. It was not a complicated thing to say. See, but the way she said it made it complicated. And he understood from the quality of her voice that she was saying something about her own arrival at Blackthorn that went past the advertisement and the letter and the stagecoach and the butcher knives. See, something about the specific accident of ending up in a particular place and finding, against expectation, that it was where you needed to be. See, he didn't respond to it directly. He wasn't built for responding to things like that directly. See, but he left his hand on the table near hers and didn't move it. And after a moment, she didn't move hers either. And that was the whole of it, nothing dramatic, nothing declared. See, just two people at a kitchen table in the deep of the worst winter in Wyoming memory, with their hands close enough to feel the warmth and a lamp burning between them. See, the account book stayed open between them until the lamp started to run low. See, she showed him the projection for February's revenue, which was the most extraordinary number Gideon Rourke had looked at since the $4,200 paper that Silas Crowell had dropped on the same table in October. See, and the difference between those two numbers was not just money. See, it was the difference between a thing ending and a thing beginning, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said it out loud, because sometimes the most true things are the ones that don't need saying. See, the fire in the hearth was low coals now. February was 8 days away, and 2 months of hard winter still stretched between Blackthorn and whatever spring was going to bring with it. See, but for the first time since October, Gideon Rourke was not afraid of what spring would find when it arrived. See, spring came to Red Hollow the way it always did in that part of Wyoming, not gently, not all at once, but in argument with the winter that had held everything locked for 4 months. See, the snow retreated by inches, then feet, then suddenly in great collapsing sheets off the pine branches, and the creek that had been frozen solid since December began moving again under the ice before the ice itself gave way. See, the roads opened slowly, reluctantly, as if the land itself wasn't sure it was ready to let people through again. See, Gideon stood in the yard on the first morning that felt genuinely different warmer air, mud where there'd been packed snow, the specific smell of ground thawing after a long freeze, and he did not feel the relief he'd expected to feel. See, he felt watchful instead, because Mara had been right. Back in January, when they'd sat at the kitchen table with the account books between them, the window that winter had given them was closing. See, and what came through the pass with the spring thaw was not going to be only good things. See, the railroad supply wagons came first. See, they rolled into the valley in mid-March, heavily loaded, and the settlements that had been buying from Blackthorn at winter premium prices were suddenly faced with a choice between established supply and cheaper product from the outside. See, 3 of the smaller accounts chose the cheaper option without much deliberation, which Mara had predicted and had factored into the February projections, so the loss was anticipated and already absorbed. See, the Hartley Railroad account held, because Hobart had signed a standing contract in February at terms that didn't expire with the weather. See, and because the camp cook had strong opinions about what his men ate, and those opinions now included Blackthorn Reserve specifically. See, but the valley opened up in other ways too, and not all of them were commercial. See, Vernon Slade came back from wherever he'd spent the winter in early April. See, he'd been gone since November. Callum had heard from someone in Red Hollow that he'd traveled south, possibly to Denver, possibly further east, and his absence had been noticed, but not discussed much at Blackthorn. See, because discussing Slade felt like inviting him in. See, when he returned, the first thing he did was ride his property line, which bordered Blackthorn's northern edge, and the second thing he did was visit Silas Crowell's bank. See, Gideon knew about the bank visit because Crowell's clerk was the younger brother of one of his hands, And news in a small valley moves through family connections faster than it moves through official channels. See, what Crowell and Slade discussed, nobody knew with certainty. See, what Gideon knew was that Slade had been watching Blackthorn all winter from a distance and had come back in spring to find the ranch he'd expected to own through foreclosure, not only standing but expanding new brick structures going up near the original smokehouse, a second wagon in the yard, cattle in better condition than they'd been in October, and 22 men who looked like they'd eaten properly for 4 months. See, he could imagine what that conversation with Crowell looked like. See, he'd had his own version of a conversation like that, except in reverse. See, the riders showed up on a Thursday in late April, not Slade's riders, not yet. See, these were strangers, and they came from the east, which was unusual. See, 2 men on good horses, dressed better than cowhands, but not as well as businessmen, which put them in a category that Gideon recognized from his mountain years as the particular category of people who do other people's difficult work. See, they rode into the yard mid-morning and asked for the owner of the property. See, Gideon came out of the ranch house and stood on the porch. See, that's me, the taller of the 2 men touched his hat. See, Mr. Rourke. We're looking for a woman named Mara Bellamy. See, we have information she may be residing on this property. See, the yard was not empty. Callum was near the barn. Cooper was working near the smokehouse. See, 2 other men were coming around from the back of the new curing structure. See, none of them had stopped moving exactly, but all of them had slowed in the particular way that men slow when they're paying attention to something. See, who's asking? Gideon said. My name is Edwin Mercer. See, I'm an investigator working on behalf of a private party in Illinois. He said it with the practiced neutrality of a man who delivers this kind of information frequently and has learned to say it without inflection. See, the matter concerns property and legal claims. If Miss Bellamy is present, I'd appreciate speaking with her directly. See, Gideon looked at him, looked at the second man who hadn't spoken and was keeping his hands in a particular position that Gideon, who had spent 15 years reading people in isolated country, noted carefully. See, wait here, he said. He went inside. Mara was in the kitchen, working through the morning's accounts. See, she looked up when he came in, and whatever she saw in his face told her something before he spoke, because she set down her pen and straightened in the chair. See, 2 men outside, Gideon said. One calls himself Edwin Mercer. See, says he's an investigator from Illinois, looking for Mara Bellamy on behalf of a private party. See, the color didn't leave her face. It was subtler than that, a stillness that came over her, a quality of absolute composure that he'd seen before, but not quite like this, not with this particular weight behind it. See, it was the stillness of a person who has been waiting for something to arrive and is now experiencing the specific, terrible relief of waiting being over. See, she said nothing for a moment. Then how many? 2. See, she stood up. She looked at the window, then at him. See, did he say who sent him? Private party in Illinois. See, nothing more. She closed the account book. She pressed her hands flat on the table for a moment, not dramatically, just the gesture of someone finding their footing before they take a step. See, then she looked at Gideon directly, and what was in her eyes was something he'd been waiting to see fully for 6 months, the thing behind all the careful pauses and the incomplete answers and the unnamed herb in the cloth-wrapped bundle. See, his name is Augustus Wycliffe, she said. He runs the largest meatpacking operation in the Midwest. See, 6 years ago I was working for his company. I developed the preservation methods he built his reputation on. See, when I left, I took nothing that wasn't mine to take my knowledge, the techniques I'd developed myself, the money that had come to me from my family, before I ever met him. She paused. See, he disagrees about the money and about the techniques. See, Gideon was very still. How much money? Enough that he's still angry 6 years later. She looked toward the window again. See, and the techniques he can't prove they're his, because they aren't. See, but he can make the argument in front of people who want to believe him, which is almost as useful. See, why does he want you back? He doesn't want me, she said. See, He wants the problem I represent solved. There's a difference. She moved toward the door. See, I'll speak to them. He caught her arm, not roughly, just enough to stop her moving for a second. See, you don't have to go out there alone. She looked at his hand on her arm. See, then at him. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but opening slightly, the way a door opens when the latch releases. See, I know, she said. But this is mine to say. He let go. See, he followed her to the porch. Mercer looked at Mara when she came out and recognized her immediately, which told Gideon he'd been given a description detailed enough to be certain. See, something moved in Mercer's expression, not unkindness, but the discomfort of a man doing a job he's been paid to do and confronting the reality of the person it affects. See, Miss Bellamy, Mercer said. Mrs. Rourke, Mara said. See, just as a fact. Mercer blinked, looked at Gideon. See, looked back at her, made the adjustment. Mrs. Rourke. See, I've been engaged by Augustus Wycliffe to locate you and… See, I know why you're here, Mara said. Say what you need to say. See, Mercer glanced at the yard around him, where Callum and Cooper and the other men had not exactly gathered, but had arranged themselves in a geometry that made the balance of numbers clear without anyone saying a word about it. See, he cleared his throat. Mr. Wycliffe asserts claims to certain property that left his household when you departed 6 years ago. See, he also asserts intellectual claims to preservation methods developed under his employ and at his expense. See, he's prepared to pursue those claims legally, which would require your return east to address them in the appropriate courts. He paused. See, he's also prepared to offer financial settlement in lieu of legal proceedings, conditional on your return, and certain agreements regarding commercial activity. See, the last two words landed with particular weight, and Gideon understood exactly what they meant. See, Wycliffe had seen, see, or heard about, see, or had someone watching, see, Blackthorn Reserve. See, he wasn't just chasing an old grievance. He was watching a commercial operation built on the methods he claimed to own, and that operation was becoming something worth stopping. See, Mara looked at Mercer for a long moment. Then she looked at the second man, who still hadn't spoken. See, who is he? She said to Mercer. My associate. He's carrying, Mara said. See, it wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact delivered in the same tone she used when reporting fire temperature or cure time. See, which means this conversation has a backup plan if I say no. See, Mercer's composure cracked slightly. Not much, mister. See, Wycliffe simply wants… I know what Mr. Wycliffe wants, Mara said. See, her voice was still level, still without drama. But there was something in it now that hadn't been there at the start of the conversation, a specific quality of patience running out. See, the sound of a person who has been careful and controlled for a very long time and is now deciding exactly how much of that to maintain. See, Mr. Wycliffe wants what he's always wanted, which is for the value I create to belong to him and the credit I've earned to be absorbed by his name. See, he's been wanting that for 6 years. He can keep wanting it. See, Mercer looked at her. He looked at the yard. He looked at Gideon. See, he made a calculation that was visible if you were watching for it, the calculation of a professional man assessing a situation that has more variables than his employer described. See, Mrs. Rourke, he said carefully. The legal claims are real. See, Mr. Wycliffe has documentation. He has documentation prepared by people he pays, Mara said. See, documentation is not evidence. What evidence would he bring to a court that I didn't develop those methods independently? What witness would testify to that, apart from people who draw salaries from his company? See, Mercer was quiet. Then something changed in the yard. See, the sound came before the sight hoofbeats, multiple, coming from the north road, which was Slade's direction. See, Gideon turned his head and saw them coming around the tree line, Vernon Slade on a gray horse, and behind him 6 riders. And the riders were not ranch hands dressed for fencing or cattle work. See, they were dressed for something else. Gideon felt the yard shift. See, he felt Callum move without looking, felt the other men adjust, felt the weight of the moment gathering like weather. See, he looked at Mercer, who had turned to watch Slade's approach with an expression that was not exactly surprise, but was not entirely composed either. See, so Mercer hadn't known about Slade, or hadn't known the timing. See, that was useful information. Slade pulled up at the edge of the yard. See, he looked at Gideon, he looked at Mara, he looked at Mercer with the expression of a man confirming that the peace he expected to be in place is in place. See, Rourke, he said. He didn't say anything to Mara, which told Gideon exactly how Slade had decided to think about her as a problem to be removed, not a person to be addressed. See, Slade, Gideon said. I understand you have legal business to conclude this morning. Has said it to Mercer, not to Gideon, which was its own kind of message. See, I'm here to ensure it concludes properly. You arranged this, Gideon said. See, not a question. Slade looked at him. He had the manner of a man who has been waiting a long time for a position of advantage and is now standing in it. See, I introduced Mr. Wycliffe to the situation here, he said. See, seemed like something he'd want to know about, given his prior relationship with your wife. He said the word with a specific precision that made it sound like what he actually meant was something else. See, the arrangement seemed mutually beneficial. Mr. Wycliffe recovers what's his. See, I have first right to purchase this property if it comes under duress. See, it won't come under duress, Gideon said. Might surprise you, Slade said. See, legal proceedings are expensive. Defending against a man with Wycliffe's resources tends to drain operations considerably. See, small ranches in particular. He looked at the new brick structures near the smokehouse. See, look back at Gideon. I'll offer you fair market value for the land. See, you take the money, avoid the legal trouble, and everyone moves forward cleanly. See, the yard was very quiet. The horses moved slightly, stamped against the mud. See, one of Slade's riders shifted in the saddle, and Callum's eyes went to him immediately. See, Gideon looked at Slade for a moment. Then he did something Slade wasn't expecting. He looked at Mara. See, she was already looking at him, and she made a small motion with her head, nearly imperceptible. Just a slight turn that he'd learned to read over 6 months of working beside her. See, it meant I have something. Let me. He said nothing. See, which was the same as permission between the two of them. See, Mara turned to Mercer. Her voice when she spoke was completely controlled, the way she'd been controlled every single time something had tried to knock her sideways since the day she'd stepped off the stagecoach. See, Mr. Mercer, she said, you're a professional. You've done this work for some time. See, Mercer waited. Augustus Wycliffe sent you here to retrieve a woman and recover property claims. See, what he told you, presumably, is that this would be straightforward. See, a woman alone in the territories, limited resources, easy to pressure. She glanced briefly at the yard, at the men positioned throughout it. See, does it look straightforward to you? Mercer said nothing. See, he also told you, I imagine, that his reputation was solid and his claims were airtight, and the risk to you professionally was minimal. She reached into her coat pocket. See, she produced a small bundle of folded papers, which she'd been carrying. Gideon had not known she'd been carrying them, but he was not surprised, because Mara did not leave important things in drawers. See, she held them out to Mercer. These are the original working documents from the preservation process I developed. See, the dates precede my employment with Wycliffe's company by 2 years. See, the handwriting is mine. The methods are detailed enough that any competent person in the field could verify they didn't originate in his facilities. See, Mercer took the papers. He looked at them. He was a professional, and what professionals do when handed documentation is read it carefully, and he read these carefully. See, his expression shifted in small increments as he read. See, this doesn't resolve the property claim, he said finally. See, the inheritance question. The inheritance question would require Wycliffe to file suit in 3 separate jurisdictions, Mara said. See, my family's property transferred through channels in 2 states that predate my association with his company. See, he knows this, which is why he hasn't filed suit in 6 years. See, because filing opens the record, and the record doesn't support him. She looked at Mercer steadily. See, what he's done for 6 years is threaten and send people to find me. See, and hope that the threat alone is enough to keep me small and quiet and away from anything he might one day want to claim. See, Mercer looked at the papers again. He looked at her. See, he looked at Gideon, who was standing very still with his arms at his sides, and at Callum, who was standing near the barn door in the specific posture of a man who has made all his decisions already and is just waiting for the moment. See, he looked at the 6 riders behind Slade, and he looked at the 8 Blackthorn men now positioned throughout the yard, and he did the arithmetic that the situation required. See, then he did something Gideon hadn't fully anticipated. See, he turned to Slade. "This isn't what you described," he said. See, quietly, without heat, but with the particular firmness of a man recalibrating. See, Slade's expression tightened. "The claims are valid." See, "The claims are complicated," Mercer said, "and contested." See, "And the situation here is considerably more established than you indicated." He folded the papers Mara had given him and held them for a moment, thinking. See, then he looked back at Mara. "What are you proposing?" See, Mara had been waiting for that question. "I'll provide you with a complete set of the documentation." See, enough that any independent assessment would call the claims against me unverifiable. See, I'll also provide you with 3 years of commercial records showing Blackthorn Reserve as an independent operation predating any renewed contact with Wycliffe's interests. She paused. See, you report to Wycliffe that the investigation was inconclusive. See, that the woman wasn't locatable with certainty, or that the legal position is weaker than he believed. See, in exchange, I surrender the last personal items I retained from his household, things that have no commercial value, but that he would want returned. She paused. See, and I offer you a personal fee for the conclusion of the matter. See, directly, for the inconvenience of a trip that didn't resolve the way your employer described. See, Mercer was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. See, then, how much, she told him. Gideon didn't know the number beforehand. See, he heard it and kept his face arranged the way she'd kept hers during the Hobart negotiation, no reaction, just presence. See, Mercer considered the offer with the expression of a man doing genuine calculation. See, whatever the number was, it was doing its work. "I'd need the documentation today," he said finally. "See, it's ready," Mara said. Mercer looked at Slade. Slade was looking at Mara with an expression that had moved past the confident satisfaction he'd arrived with into something harder and less composed. "See, this isn't," he started. "Mr. Slade," Mercer said, in the tone of a professional addressing someone who is no longer the most important person in the conversation. "See, my engagement is with Mr. Wycliffe, not with you. See, our arrangement was contingent on a successful resolution, and the resolution I can offer Mr. See, Wycliffe is the one that keeps him out of a court proceeding he can't guarantee winning." He looked back at Mara. "See, I'll take the documentation and the fee." Slade looked at his riders. See, he looked at the Blackthorn men arranged throughout the yard. See, he looked at Gideon. Gideon had been waiting for this. See, he'd been waiting for the moment when Slade realized that Mercer had stepped out of the play, and the play now required him to act on his own. See, he watched Slade's face go through the calculations, the number of men, the terrain, the distance to the ranch house. See, what he could actually accomplish here against a property that was legally paid up and documented, and whose owner was standing in front of him with 8 armed men and a wife who had just successfully negotiated an investigator out of the field. "See, this isn't finished," Slade said to Gideon. "Yes, it is," Gideon said. "See, for today." Slade's jaw moved. He looked at the yard one more time. See, then he pulled his horse around, without giving any of it the satisfaction of being dramatic about it, and rode back toward the north road. See, his riders followed. The last one glanced back once, and Callum's eyes tracked him until he was out of sight. See, the yard exhaled. Mercer spent 2 hours at the ranch house that afternoon. See, Mara produced the documentation she'd promised. It had been in the same trunk she'd arrived with, the one full of butcher knives and curing salt, and one cloth-wrapped bundle, the documents wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom. See, kept safe through a fire and 6 months of Wyoming winter. See, she went through the papers with Mercer methodically. answering questions, and Gideon sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing. See, he was there because this was his house, and it was right for him to be there, but the work was Mara's. See, at one point Mercer looked up from a page and said, not unkindly, "You built all of this to be out of his reach." See, Mara didn't answer immediately. She looked at the papers on the table. See, "I built all of this," she said, "because it was worth building." See, Mercer nodded slowly. He said nothing else on that subject. See, when the documentation was organized and the transaction concluded and Mercer and his associate had ridden out, the ranch house was quiet. See, Mara sat at the table where the papers had been and looked at the empty surface in front of her. See, Gideon poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat down across from her without asking if she wanted company. See, she looked at the coffee. She looked at her hands, which were flat on the table, and for the first time in all the months he'd watched her work and negotiate and plan, she looked tired. See, not broken, not defeated, just tired in the bone-deep way that people look when they've been carrying something for a very long time and have just set it down, and the setting down itself is almost more exhausting than the carrying was. See, "It's not over with Slade," she said. "No," Gideon said. See, "But today it is." She picked up the coffee. She held it in both hands the way cold people hold things. "See, 6 years," see, she said quietly. "See, more to the air than to him. See, every time I found somewhere to work, somewhere to build something, there was always the question of whether he was still looking. See, whether someone had talked, whether the next person through the door was someone he'd sent." She looked at the window. See, "I stopped letting myself stay anywhere long enough to find out." See, Gideon said nothing. He knew how to be quiet in useful ways. See, "I almost didn't come west," she said. "When your advertisement arrived, I'd seen others." See, answered none. Because answering meant giving a name and a location to a record that he could find. She set down the coffee. See, "I don't know why yours was different." He thought about what Callum had written. See, the last sentence which he'd added himself, "No deceptions on either side." See, he didn't say this out loud, he just sat with it. "I'm glad it was," he said finally. See, she looked at him. Something in her face did the thing it had done when he'd shown her the receipt from Cruel's bank, that slight release, that brief loosening of something held at long tension. See, but this time it went further. See, this time the composure that she wore like a second coat, the one she'd built up over years of being alone in situations that didn't allow for vulnerability, it didn't break. Because Mara Bellamy's composure didn't break, but it yielded. See, just enough for him to see what was behind it. "I need to tell you the full account of it," she said. See, the money, the methods, what happened in that company. See, all of it. Not because Mercer's coming back, but because she stopped. See, started again. Because you deserve to know what you married. See, what you stood in a yard for today. The whole of it, not just the parts I've given you in pieces. See, he looked at her steadily. "You can tell me whenever you're ready." See, "I'm ready now," she said. Outside, the spring afternoon had turned the kind of golden that only comes in April, when the light is still thin enough to be precise. See, the sound of the men working drifted in from the yard, hammering from the new curing structure. Someone calling across to someone near the barn, the ordinary daily sound of a ranch that is building rather than surviving. See, she told him all of it. It took an hour, possibly more. See, he didn't look at the clock. She told him about the company in Illinois, the operation she'd started with and grown and transformed using methods she'd spent years developing before she ever walked through Wycliffe's doors. See, she told him about the inheritance, her mother's money, not large but real, which Wycliffe had folded into the business, accounting with a confidence that assumed she would not notice or would not object if she did. See, she told him what it was like to object, and what happened to women in industrial commerce who objected to men like Wycliffe in the year 1881. See, and what she'd lost in the course of learning exactly how little legal protection her objections carried. See, she told him how she'd left, not dramatically, not with confrontation, she'd left practically, in the way she did everything, taking only what she could legally claim and moving before he had fully organized his response. See, she'd been in 4 different locations in the years between Illinois and Wyoming, none of them long enough to be called a home, all of them places where she'd worked and not stayed. See, Gideon listened to all of it. He asked 2 questions. See, he didn't ask them to challenge her or to verify anything he asked, because there were 2 gaps in the account where he genuinely needed to understand the shape of what had happened. See, when she finished, the kitchen was quiet. He said, "The papers you showed Mercer." See, they were real, yes. Everything you built here, the methods, the process, the product, that's yours. See, it always was, she said. And then, quietly, I just needed somewhere to prove it. See, he looked at his coffee, which had gone cold while she talked. See, he looked at his hands. He thought about the question that had been sitting at the back of his thinking for 3 months about what had become of this arrangement that he'd placed an advertisement for. See, about the shape of a thing that had started as practicality and turned into something considerably more complicated and considerably more valuable. See, he said, "I want to talk to you about the spring contract with the railroad." See, she blinked. The shift in subject caught her slightly, which was rare. See now, in a minute, he looked at her directly before that. See, this ranch, what you've built here, what we've built, it's not the same as what the advertisement said. See, the arrangement isn't the same. She looked at him carefully. See, she was reading him the way she read everything attentively, without assumption. See, "I'm not asking you to stay because I need a cook," he said. See, "I'm not asking you to stay because of what you can do for the operation." He stopped, because he was not a man who made speeches, and he knew when he was getting close to making one. See, he simplified. "I'm asking you to stay because you're my wife, and I'd like you to actually be that." See, the kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him for a long time. See, he didn't look away, which cost him something, because he was more comfortable being the one who absorbed silence than the one who waited in it. See, "I was already staying," she said. It was so simply put that it took him a moment to hear what was in it, not just the agreement, but the time marker. See, already, which meant the decision had been made before this moment, somewhere in the months of fires and negotiations and wagon runs and late nights at the kitchen table, and she'd been waiting to see if he would catch up. See, he almost smiled. "Should have mentioned that. You weren't ready to hear it," she said. See, and the composure slipped enough, just for a moment, to show something that might have been the beginning of an actual smile underneath it. See, outside, the spring light was moving across the yard. See, somewhere near the new curing structure, 2 men were arguing about the best way to brace a corner post, and from the sound of it, they'd been arguing about it for a while and weren't close to resolution. See, Mara heard it. She stood up automatically and then stopped herself. See, looked at Gideon. "The corner post," she said. "I heard it. See, Dex is going to put the brace on the wrong side, and it'll shift when the ground settles." See, "He's done it wrong 3 times in his life," Gideon said. See, "He'll figure it out." She sat back down. She picked up the cold coffee. See, she looked at the table, and something in her face settled into a different arrangement than the one he'd seen on the stagecoach platform in October, the same controlled surface. But the thing behind the eyes was different now. See, less braced, less ready to move. He thought about what Callum had said in the winter about a man working hard enough for something that it becomes his. See, about how belonging wasn't about the name on the deed. See, she had built something here. Out of 3 cattle and an ash-smelling smokehouse and 22 skeptical ranch hands and 1 desperate rancher who hadn't known what he was sending train fare for. See, she had built it the same way she did everything precisely practically, without performing confidence she actually felt. See, and somewhere in the building of it, Blackthorn had become hers the way it was his. See, from outside, Dex's voice rose by half a pitch. Someone else's voice responded. See, then a third voice, Callum, cutting through both of them, with the particular authority of a man who has seen this argument before. See, Gideon and Mara sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house and listened to the ranch making its ordinary noise around them, and neither of them went out to fix what was being fixed. See, and the coffee stayed cold, and the spring light moved across the floor. See, the corner post, whatever happened with it, could wait. See, Dex got the corner post wrong, exactly as Mara had predicted. See, it took 3 weeks for the ground to settle enough to make the problem visible. See, and when it did a slight but definitive lean to the southeast corner of the new curing structure, nobody said anything about who had argued what during the construction. See, they just fixed it. That was how things worked at Blackthorn by the spring of 1888. Problems got identified, addressed, and moved past without ceremony. See, because there was always the next thing demanding attention, and spending energy on being right about the last thing was a luxury the ranch had never been able to afford. See, Gideon noticed this without commenting on it. See, he noticed a lot of things that spring that he didn't comment on because he was still in the process of understanding what Blackthorn had become and what that meant for how he understood himself inside it. See, he had built this ranch over 15 years with the particular stubbornness of a man who had no family money and no inherited land and no advantages beyond physical endurance and the willingness to stay in a place that discouraged staying. See, he'd built it alone, managed it alone, made every significant decision alone. See, the aloneness had never felt like a lack, exactly more like a condition of the work, the way cold was a condition of Wyoming winters. See, what the last 6 months had shown him, slowly and without announcement, was that aloneness had also been a ceiling. See, not on what he could endure, on what he could build. See, Vernon Slade did not disappear after the April confrontation. See, Gideon hadn't expected him to. What Slade did was what calculated men do when a direct approach fails. He went quiet and waited and looked for a different angle. See, and Gideon spent the better part of April and May in a state of low-grade watchfulness that was exhausting in a way that open conflict wasn't, because at least open conflict gave you something to push against. See, the angle Slade found was water rights. It came through the county office in late May, filed without announcement, a formal challenge to Blackthorn's claim on the Northern Creek section that ran along the boundary between the two properties. See, the creek fed the cattle through summer and supplied the water Mara's operation used for cleaning and processing. See, without it, the curing operation became significantly more expensive and the herd significantly more difficult to maintain through the dry months. See, with it contested in county proceedings, every plan Mara had built for summer expansion sat on uncertain ground. See, Gideon brought the filing home on a Tuesday evening. See, he put it on the kitchen table without speaking, and Mara read it twice, which was once more than most things required. See, he can't win this, she said. The creek rights predate his purchase of the north property by 9 years. See, he doesn't have to win, Gideon said. He has to slow us down long enough to matter. See, she looked at him. She understood what he meant immediately because she'd spent 6 years understanding exactly how men like Slade operated, not through direct confrontation, which could be fought directly, but through attrition. See, through the patient application of friction until the thing being resisted wore down. See, the railroad contract negotiation is in July, she said. See, yes, the railroad contract, the big one. See, not the individual camp account with Hober, but a potential standing agreement with the entire regional line for provisioning 3 major construction projects through 1889 was the thing Mara had been building toward since February. See, she'd been in correspondence with the railroad's regional procurement office for 2 months. See, the numbers involved were substantial enough that Gideon had stopped keeping the projections in his head and started writing them down. See, which was not something he'd done since the early days of the ranch, when keeping it in his head had been manageable because there wasn't very much of it. See, if the water rights challenge moved into formal proceedings, it would cost money and time they needed elsewhere. See, more importantly, it would be visible to the railroad procurement people who did not like uncertainty in their suppliers. See, a ranch with contested water rights was a ranch with an operational question mark, and the railroad could find suppliers without question marks. See, Slade knew all of this. That was what made it smart, in the particular ugly way that small-minded strategy can be smart. See, Gideon hired a land attorney from Casper. See, the man arrived in early June, a spare, exacting individual named Whitfield who wore the same brown coat every day and had the manner of someone who had been underestimated sufficiently often to find it professionally useful. See, Whitfield reviewed the original Blackthorn land documentation, the creek rights, filing, and Slade's challenge in a single afternoon, and then spent the evening writing. And what he produced was a counterfiling that, in Gideon's layman reading, essentially informed the county office that the challenge had no legal basis and should be dismissed. And furthermore documented 5 specific occasions on which Slade's use of the northern fence line had already implicitly acknowledged Blackthorn's creek rights as established. It was good work, but good legal work moved at the speed of county offices, which was not a speed that matched July negotiation timelines. Mara handled it the way she handled things that couldn't be fully resolved. By direct action, she worked around them. She began documenting the operation's water usage and demonstrating to the railroad's procurement contact that the creek dispute was a bad faith filing without legal merit. Preemptively addressing the uncertainty before it could become a reason for hesitation. She did this in correspondence, so precisely calibrated that Gideon, reading over her shoulder one evening, thought it was the most effective piece of writing he'd seen, not because it was eloquent, but because it gave the procurement office exactly the information they needed to feel confident while giving them none of the information that would make them worried. How do you know what they need to hear? He asked. She looked at the letter. I know what they're afraid of, she said. I give them evidence that the fear is unfounded. That's all anyone in commerce wants to be shown, that the risk is smaller than they thought. He thought about that for a long time after. He thought about it in the context of the ranch and the letters and the railroad. But he also thought about it in a different context, a personal one, because there was something she'd said that applied to more than procurement correspondence. Most of what Mara Bellamy had done at Blackthorn, from the first conversation in the smokehouse to the April confrontation with Mercer, was exactly that, finding out what people were afraid of and showing them evidence that the fear was manageable. She'd done it with 22 skeptical cowboys. She'd done it with a frozen railroad foreman. She'd done it with an investigator sent to drag her east. She'd done it, quietly and without ever naming it, with Gideon himself, who had been afraid, in a way he hadn't acknowledged, of exactly what he was now standing in the middle of. The water rights challenge was dismissed on a Thursday in late June. Whitfield sent word from Casper with a note that said simply as expected. The filing was not well constructed. Bill enclosed. Gideon paid the bill the same day it arrived, which was a satisfaction of the particular variety that comes from solving a problem cleanly. 3 days later, Callum came to him with something else. The something else was a man named Doyle, who worked as a stable hand at the Red Hollow livery, and who had come to Callum because he'd heard that Blackthorn paid fair and kept its word, and he had information that might be worth something. What Doyle had was not complicated. He had seen Vernon Slade, on 2 separate occasions in the past month, meeting with 2 men at the livery after dark. He didn't know who the men were. He knew they weren't from the valley. He knew they'd come in from the East Road and gone back out the East Road both times, which was the direction that didn't go toward Casper, but did go toward the rail line. Gideon paid Doyle fairly and asked him to keep listening. What Doyle brought back a week later was the name Slade had said, overheard through a livery partition on a night. Doyle had been working late. The name was Wycliffe. Slade was still talking to Wycliffe. Mercer's inconclusive report had not, apparently, ended the relationship. Whether Wycliffe was feeding Slade information, or Slade was feeding Wycliffe information about Blackthorn's commercial progress, or both of them were planning something that required coordination, Doyle couldn't say, because he'd only heard the name, not the context. See, Gideon sat with this information for 2 days before he told Mara. See, he sat with it because he was trying to work out what it meant practically and what it required from them, and whether there was anything to be done about it, or whether it was the kind of threat that simply had to be watched and not chased. See, when he told her she was in the smokehouse. See, she'd been adjusting the sage ratio again for the summer batches, which required a different balance than the winter curing because the ambient temperature changed the evaporation rate of the volatile compounds. See, which was the kind of thing Gideon now understood because she'd explained it to him, and he decided to actually learn rather than just defer. See, she heard him out without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, checking the fire color with the same attention she'd given it on the first night she'd kept watch. See, Wycliffe's company is struggling, she said. He blinked. See, what? I've been receiving the Chicago commercial papers since February. See, the reports on the Wycliffe packing operation have been declining quarter over quarter. See, his best people have been leaving not all at once, quietly, the way people leave when they know a company is losing direction. She set down the tool she'd been holding. See, the methods he built his reputation on have been degrading since I left because the people applying them didn't fully understand what they were doing or why. See, he's been compensating with volume and cutting quality to protect margins. She looked at Gideon. See, he's not just angry about what I built here. He's desperate. See, Blackthorn Reserve is becoming exactly the kind of commercial success that demonstrates publicly what his operation lost when I walked out the door. See, Gideon considered this. He can't let that stand. See, no, she said. He can't let it be seen to stand. See, there's a difference. He doesn't want to destroy Blackthorn. See, he wants to acquire it, or discredit it, or both. Something that lets him fold what we've built into his name. See, Slade's the access point. Slade's the local instrument, she said. See, he offers Wycliffe a way to pressure us through local channels that don't leave a direct trail back to Illinois. She picked up the tool again. See, which means the water rights challenge was only the first attempt. See, he'll try something else. She was right. But what happened next was not what either of them had anticipated, because it didn't come from Slade directly. See, it came from Hobart. See, the railroad's regional procurement contact arrived at Blackthorn in the second week of July, which was itself unexpected. They'd been conducting the contract negotiation by correspondence, and a physical visit had not been scheduled. See, Hobart was a reserved man, not given to unplanned travel, and when Gideon saw the railroad company buggy come up the road, he felt the particular alertness that came from a pattern being broken. See, Hobart came inside. He sat at the kitchen table, which was where every significant conversation at Blackthorn seemed to happen. See, and he accepted coffee and looked uncomfortable in the way that people look uncomfortable when they're something they'd rather not be carrying. See, we've had a communication, he said, from a meatpacking interest in Illinois. See, concerning Blackthorn Reserve. Mara was very still. See, they're claiming intellectual property interest in the preservation methods used in your product, Hobart said. See, he was looking at neither of them specifically, the way people look at the middle distance when they feel bad about what they're saying. See, they've provided documentation to our corporate office, suggesting the methods were developed under their employ and were taken without authorization. See, the kitchen was quiet. Outside, someone was working near the new curing house, the sound of it coming in through the window. See, they contacted your corporate office, Mara said. See, yes, not a court, she said, not a lawyer filing anything official. See, they contacted your office directly. Hobart paused. See, that's correct. Because the documentation doesn't hold up in court, she said. See, which they know. So they're applying pressure through your procurement channel instead, hoping your company's risk management would rather walk away from us than investigate the actual legal position. She looked at him steadily. See, that's what's happening. Hobart looked at his coffee. See, he was not a dishonest man Gideon had developed that read of him over months of transactions and found it reliable. See, he was an uncomfortable man who'd been put in an uncomfortable position by people who understood how to exploit institutional caution. See, the corporate office is concerned, he said. Then let me address their concern directly, Mara said. See, she stood, went to the office room off the kitchen, the small room that had been a storage space in October, and was now where she kept the commercial records, and came back with a folder. See, she set it on the table in front of Hobart. Documentation of the original development of these methods, predating my association with that company by 2 years. See, independent analysis of the cure process from a food preservation consultant in Denver. I engaged him in March when I anticipated this move. See, a legal opinion from an attorney in Casper confirming the methods are not covered by any patent or proprietary claim that Wycliffe's company has filed. She tapped the folder. See, there's also a letter you can forward to your corporate office that summarizes all of this in language their lawyers will recognize. See, Hobart looked at the folder. He looked at it for a long time. See, then he looked at Mara with an expression that had several layers to it, professional relief, and something underneath that was closer to admiration. See, and underneath that, a kind of wary respect for someone who had seen this coming and built the defense before the attack arrived. See, you prepared for this, he said. Months ago, she said. See, take the folder. Show it to your office. If they have specific questions, I'll answer them in writing or in person, whichever they prefer. See, Hobart took the folder. He drank his coffee. He looked at Gideon. See, she's formidable, he said. Not to Mara, not to the air, directly to Gideon, in the tone of a man making an observation he found genuinely impressive. See, since I've known her, Gideon said. It was the same thing he'd said in the yard in April, and it was still true, and he said it with exactly the same amount of weight it carried then. See, the contract was signed in August. See, not the reduced version that the corporate office had initially floated after the Wycliffe communication, the full version, the standing agreement through 1889, with the terms Mara had negotiated in the spring. See, it came with a note from the procurement office acknowledging that the documentation provided had resolved their concerns completely, which was the corporate way of saying they'd been leaned on. See, had checked the facts and found the leaning had been dishonest. See, what happened to Slade happened in September, and it happened without Gideon doing anything to cause it directly, which was a kind of satisfaction that was different from direct action, but not lesser. See, Slade's ranch had been over-leveraged for 2 years. Callum had known this from conversations at the Red Hollow feed store. See, where men talked about each other's finances with the casual thoroughness of people who lived close enough together that financial trouble was everyone's weather. See, the early winter of 1887 had hit Slade's herd harder than he'd admitted publicly. See, and the money he'd spent on Rafe Dugan and on the water rights challenge and on whatever arrangement he'd maintained with Wycliffe's people, all of that had drained resources from an operation that didn't have surplus to drain. See, his bank called his notes in September. See, Silas Crowell, who had the particular talent of institutional loyalty without personal loyalty, called Slade's notes the same way he'd tried to call Gideon's, with the same 30-day notice and the same paper dropped on a table like it was nothing. See, except Slade didn't have 22 men and a smokehouse in Mara Bellamy. See, he had creditors and empty curing houses and a ranch that had spent a year trying to destroy someone else instead of building anything of its own. See, he sold the property to a family from Nebraska in October and was gone from the valley by the end of the month. See, Gideon heard about it from Callum, who heard from Doyle at the livery, and he sat with the information for a morning before telling Mara. See, she received it without celebration, which he'd expected. See, I didn't want him ruined, she said. I just wanted him to stop. See, he stopped, Gideon said. Yes, she looked out the window. See, people who spend all their energy trying to take what other people built tend to end up with nothing of their own. See, that's not justice. It's just arithmetic. He thought about that for a long time. See, he thought about it in the way that things Mara said sometimes needed to be thought about, not immediately, but carried around and turned over, examined in different light. See, she had a way of stating things that sounded simple on the surface and then revealed more architecture underneath the longer you held them. See, he'd gotten used to this. See, he'd come to depend on it in a way that surprised him when he noticed it, the dependence of a man who'd spent 15 years being entirely self-reliant, discovering that relying on someone else's thinking didn't diminish him. See, it made him better at thinking. In November, Wycliffe's company filed for reduced operations. See, the Chicago papers reported it as a market contraction, a strategic reorganization, the language that companies use when they don't want to say what's actually happening. See, what was happening, reading between those lines, was that a business built substantially on methods it didn't fully own or understand was now exposed as such, and the market was responding accordingly. See, 2 of Wycliffe's major distribution contracts went to competitors in the fourth quarter. See, a third went to a smaller regional operation that Mara noted, with a dry satisfaction, was run by a woman who had been a floor supervisor at Wycliffe's plant until the previous year. See, she'll do it properly, Mara said, reading the report. See, how do you know? Gideon asked. Because she left when she figured out she was doing the work and getting none of the recognition, Mara said. See, women who reach that conclusion and still choose to stay in the work rather than abandon it entirely are the ones who understand what they're doing and why it matters. She folded the paper. See, she'll build something real. Wycliffe himself never made another move against Blackthorn. See, whether Mercer's report had genuinely convinced him the legal position was weak, or whether the railroad contract and the Denver consultant's analysis had made the calculation unfavorable. See, or whether a man watching his own operation deteriorate simply had less energy for external battles. Whatever the reason, the silence from Illinois became permanent. See, after a year, Mara stopped waiting for it to break. See, that was the year things at Blackthorn shifted from building to built, which is its own kind of transition and not an easy one. See, there is something about crisis that organizes people, gives them a clear direction and a shared purpose, and a reason to put aside their individual grievances and smaller ambitions. See, the crisis at Blackthorn had done exactly that, had taken 22 men who might have drifted away and given them something worth staying for. See, had taken 2 people who might have remained professionally arm's length and made that distance impossible to maintain. See, what came after crisis was different. What came after crisis was ordinary life, which is harder in some ways than the crisis was, because it doesn't have the same clarity. See, Dex Whitlow left the ranch in the spring of the second year. See, not badly, he'd saved enough through the profitable winter and the contract year to buy a small piece of land east of Red Hollow and start his own operation. See, which he told Gideon about with the slightly nervous directness of a man who isn't sure how his news will be received. See, Gideon shook his hand and meant it. Dex had been one of the first to push back on Mara and one of the first to come around, and both things were true about him, and neither negated the other. See, Cooper followed 18 months after that. For different reasons, he'd been corresponding with a woman in Kansas for over a year, and she'd finally agreed to come west. See, and the combination of a wife coming and the money he'd saved changed his calculations about what he needed. See, Gideon let him go with a month's bonus because Cooper had been at Blackthorn in the worst of it and had brought him the information about the Henderson cattle that had made the expansion possible. See, other men came, different men, hired through proper channels, paid properly from the start, working on a ranch whose reputation in the territory had changed entirely from what it had been in October of 1887. See, you could not hire a man in that part of Wyoming without him having heard of Blackthorn Reserve and having some opinion about it. See, most of those opinions were good. The ones that weren't were usually held by men who worked for outfits that competed with the railroad contracts, which Gideon took as a reasonable indicator that those men were paying attention. See, Callum stayed. That was the constant. Callum was still at Blackthorn 5 years later, still wearing the same hat, still managing the ranch operations with the same flat competence that had made him invaluable before any of this happened. See, he had declined 2 offers of foreman positions at larger ranches during the second and third years. See, which Gideon had heard about from the ranchers who'd made the offers and hadn't heard about from who didn't mention things he'd already decided. See, why'd you stay? Gideon asked him once. It was a genuine question, asked on a morning when they were riding fence in the third year, when Blackthorn was profitable enough that staying was no longer an act of loyalty under duress. See, Callum rode in silence for a moment. I was here when it was nothing, he said finally. See, I'd like to be here when it's something. It's something now, Gideon said. See, getting there, Callum said, which was as close to a compliment as Callum got about anything. See, the railroad spur came in the 4th year. It was Mara who had pushed for it, not in the way that people push for things they want, with enthusiasm and pressure, but in the way she did everything. See, with careful documentation of why it was economically sensible for the railroad to extend a short spur line to the Blackthorn property rather than continue the expensive wagon transport of large orders to the main line. See, she'd made the case to the regional procurement office, backed it with volume commitments that made the construction cost recoverable in under 2 years. See, and the railroad had agreed because it was the sensible thing to do, and she'd given them all the numbers they needed to see that. See, when the spur was completed, Gideon stood at the edge of the property and watched the first freight car pull up to the newly constructed loading dock. See, and he thought about a man who had spent 15 years building a ranch in country that didn't make building easy, and what it looked like when 15 years of stubbornness met the right kind of partner. See, he didn't say this out loud. He wasn't built for saying things like that out loud in front of audiences. See, but he thought it clearly, standing there in the autumn light, with the first freight car sitting at the dock and the sound of men loading it coming from behind him. See, Mara came to stand beside him. She looked at the freight car. See, she looked at the dock. She looked at the private spur line that connected Blackthorn Valley directly to the railroad that ran through the entire Western Territory. See, well, she said, yeah, he said. That was the whole of it. See, 2 people who had never been good at speeches, standing in the autumn quiet with something they'd built together visible in front of them, finding that 2 words were sufficient. See, the name came from a newspaper. Not a Wyoming paper, a Chicago commercial paper, one of the ones Mara had been reading since February of the first year. See, a correspondent had apparently traveled through the territory and filed a piece on commercial operations in the New West, and Blackthorn Reserve had been mentioned. See, and the correspondent had apparently asked someone in Red Hollow about the woman who ran the preservation operation. See, the piece referred to her as the Iron Woman of Blackthorn, which was the kind of name that journalists attach to people who decline to be made into a soft story and can't be pushed into a more comfortable shape. See, Mara read the piece at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. See, she read it twice, which was still once more than most things required. See, then she set the paper down and said nothing. Iron Woman, Gideon said. See, he'd read it over her shoulder. It's reductive, she said. See, it'll stick, he said. It did. Within a year, it was how people in the regional railroad offices referred to her, which meant it was how the procurement correspondents addressed her, which meant it was on official railroad documentation. See, which Mara found professionally irritating and personally somewhere between resigned and amused, though she would only admit to the resigned part. See, what the name captured, imperfectly and reductively as names always do, was something real about how she operated in the world. See, not that she was hard, she was not without warmth, had never been, but warmth was not the first thing she led with, because she'd learned in an Illinois packing operation what happened to women who led with warmth in commercial settings. See, what she was, precisely, was someone who could not be pushed off a position she'd determined was correct, and could not be pressured into accepting less than she'd calculated was fair, and could not be made to apologize for knowing what she knew. See, that was the iron. The rest of her was considerably more complicated than the name suggested, but the name was about the part that the world interacted with first. See, Gideon interacted with the rest of it, which was his particular privilege, and one he was aware of in the way that you're aware of good fortune when it's not been the general pattern of your experience. See, she was not easy to live with. He would not have said that to anyone, and she would not have claimed it about herself, but it was true. See, she had opinions about operational decisions that she would not soften to spare a man's feelings, which was professionally valuable and personally occasionally maddening. See, she had a tendency to work past the point where a reasonable person would have stopped, which had never diminished from the first night she'd tended the smokehouse fire alone. See, and which Gideon had learned to address by simply appearing where she was working with food, because that was more effective than asking her to stop. See, she had the particular stubbornness of a person who had survived by relying on themselves and found it difficult to fully distribute that weight even when the distribution was offered. See, he was not easy to live with either, and he knew it. See, he was a man of deep habits and moderate flexibility. See, he had spent 15 years as the final authority on every decision and found it difficult, sometimes, to hold that loosely to be in the conversation about a decision rather than at the end of it. See, he had the frontier man's particular form of stoicism, which was useful in hardship and sometimes produced a silence that felt like distance when it was just him processing something slowly. See, he did not say important things easily. Mara had learned to read him in the gaps, which she did with the same attentiveness she brought to reading fire temperature and what weather, not by what was said, but by the precise quality of what wasn't. See, they had arguments, real ones, occasionally, the kind where both people are genuinely convinced they're right, and neither is entirely wrong, which are the hardest kind to navigate because they don't resolve cleanly. See, there was a significant one in the third year about whether to expand the cattle operation or concentrate resources on the preservation side. See, which lasted 3 days and involved 2 evenings at the kitchen table with the account books out and voices that were not raised but were precise in the way that more dangerous than raised. See, Callum made himself scarce during all 3 days, which was a form of tactical wisdom that Gideon respected. See, they resolved it the way they resolved most things, not by one person winning, but by working through it, and until they found the position that was actually correct, which turned out to be different from either of the positions they'd started with. See, expand the cattle operation modestly while concentrating capital investment on the preservation infrastructure. See, it worked. It worked because they'd thought it through fully and honestly instead of one of them conceding to keep the peace. See, that was the thing about a marriage between 2 people who had both survived alone for a long time. See, they hadn't come to each other needing to be completed. See, they'd come to each other as whole, stubborn, specific people with established ways of moving through the world. See, the marriage was not a merger of 2 incomplete halves. See, it was something harder and more interesting than that 2 separate, intact people who had chosen to build something together that neither could have built alone. See, and who maintained that choice actively and sometimes with difficulty, rather than simply falling into it and calling it fate. See, on an evening in the autumn of 1,892 5 years from the October morning, when Silas Crowell had walked into the ranch house without knocking and dropped a paper on the table, like it was nothing, Gideon stood outside the original smokehouse and looked at what Blackthorn Valley had become. See, the original smokehouse still stood. Mara had been clear about that when the new brick curing houses went up, the original structure would remain maintained and functional, because it was where the operation had started, and she was not interested in pretending that something had begun anywhere other than where it had actually begun. There was something in that insistence that was characteristically Mara, a refusal to revise history into a cleaner story than it had actually been. The original smokehouse was small and old, and slightly crooked on its foundation, and it stood next to 4 brick curing houses and a warehouse and a loading dock served by a private rail spur, and the contrast was not embarrassing. The contrast was the point. The supper bell rang from the kitchen. The sound of it carried across the yard in the cooling autumn air, and the men working near the loading dock and the curing houses began moving toward the main building, not just the original 22, most of whom had moved on to their own operations by now, but the current hands, some of them younger than the operation itself, who worked a ranch that was unrecognizable from what it had been, and who knew it only as what it was. Mara came out of the main curing house and crossed the yard. She had the day's production logs in her hand, which she would review at supper, because she reviewed the production logs at supper. And this was one of those habits that Gideon had stopped having opinions about. She walked past him toward the main building, and then stopped, turned back, looked at him standing there at the edge of the yard, looking at the original smokehouse. You're doing the thinking thing, she said. What thinking thing? The standing and looking thing where you're thinking something you're not going to say. He was quiet for a moment. I was thinking about $30. She looked at him. What? The train fare. He looked at the smokehouse. I spent $30 sending a stranger west because I thought I needed someone to cook for 22 men. He paused. That was what I thought I was doing. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the smokehouse, then at the brick buildings behind it, then at the rail spur in the far distance. And what were you actually doing? She said. He thought about 22 men who'd stayed through 6 weeks of unpaid wages and fought a fire at midnight in their long johns and organized themselves into a workforce around a curing schedule because it had become theirs. He thought about Dex Whitlow, who had land of his own now. Cooper, who had a wife and a son born in the spring. Alton, who had stayed at Blackthorn and was now a supervisor of the curing operation and ate very slowly at supper in the way of a man who has learned to appreciate meals. He thought about Callum, who was probably already at the table, hat on, waiting for the food. He thought about a woman who had stepped off a stagecoach carrying butcher knives instead of wedding dresses and had spent the next 5 years being impossible and right and essential and occasionally exhausting. And who was standing in front of him right now in a coat that had seen better days, holding production logs, waiting for his answer. I don't know exactly, he said finally, but I think it was the right thing. She looked at him with that expression that was not quite a smile, but had the same warmth under it. It was the right thing, she said, without qualification. They walked to the main building together. Not side by side in any ceremonial way, just moving in the same direction, the way people move who have spent enough time together that proximity is no longer something they think about. Through the window of the main building, the light was warm, and the sound of men settling into their seats came out into the yard, the ordinary comfortable noise of people who have worked hard and know there's food coming. Gideon held the door. Mara walked through. He followed. The table was full. It was a different table, in a larger room than the 122 men had crowded around in the winter of 1887. But the specific quality of fullness was the same people who had worked hard and would eat well and would get up tomorrow and do it again. Callum had his hat on until Mara sat down and then took it off, which was the ritual. Alton was already cutting his bread. 2 of the newer hands were arguing about something concerning the loading dock organization, an argument that would not be resolved at supper, and probably not tomorrow either. Gideon sat at his end of the table. Mara sat at hers. She opened the production logs. He let her. This was not a perfect life. The ranch had debt some years and surplus others. The winter of 1890 had been almost as bad as the winter of 1887 and had cost them 30 head and 1 full month of production. There was a legal dispute with a competing provisioner in 1891 that had cost money and attention and an irritating amount of correspondence. Gideon had a bad fall from a horse in the spring of 1892 that had kept him off full work for 6 weeks, and during which Marsa had been professionally efficient about managing his recovery and personally terrible at pretending she wasn't worried. See, which he had found moving in a way he would not have predicted. See, life was not perfect, and the ranch was not perfect, and neither of them was anything close to perfect. See, but there was food on the table every night, and there were people around the table who had built something together that had cost them real things and was worth what it cost. And there were no wolves at the door, not the hungry kind. See, not the financial kind, not the kind that comes from Illinois with documentation and bad intentions. See, the supper bell had done its work. Everyone was in. See, Gideon looked down the table at Mara, who was reading the production logs with one hand and eating with the other. See, who would look up in approximately 4 minutes when she finished the relevant section and say something about tomorrow's curing schedule that would either require a response or would simply be noted, depending on what it was. See, he waited for the 4 minutes. He ate. Around him, the table noise rose and fell the way it always did, the specific texture of people who work together every day and have run out of things to be formal about with each other and are just, see, talking, just being in a room together, just eating. See, the light from the lamps was warm and specific. Outside, the autumn evening was settling over Blackthorn Valley, the way autumn evenings do in Wyoming, fast and gold, and with the particular clarity that comes right before the cold returns. See, Mara looked up from the production logs. She found him looking at her, which she noted without comment, and she said, "The third curing house is running about 4 degrees cooler than optimal. See, I need someone to check the fire management on the overnight shift." "See, I'll tell Alton," he said. She nodded and went back to the logs. See, the table kept eating. The lamps burned. The autumn settled. See, somewhere outside, in the original smokehouse that still stood at the center of everything, the fire burned low and steady the way she'd taught them to keep it. See, even now, 5 years later, that was the standard, her standard, the one she'd set on the first night she'd stayed up watching it alone, because she didn't yet trust anyone else to read it the way it needed to be read. See, nobody needed to watch it alone anymore. That was not nothing. See, in a life where most things were complicated and provisional and required constant maintenance, that was not nothing at all.